Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Now beginning story 1. The Mound Builders of Cahokia, Forgotten Kings of the Mississippi. Long before the arrival of European settlers, before the names of states and borders stretched across the map, there was a city rising from the banks of the Mississippi River. It had no stone palaces or golden temples. Its walls were not carved in marble but packed by hand, layer after layer in brown earth. The city's name Cahokia was not known to its builders. That name came much later. To the people who lived there, it was simply the center of the world. By the 11th century, Cahokia was the largest city north of Mesoamerica. At its height, it sprawled across 6 square miles, with a population possibly exceeding 20,000 people, a number that would not be matched in what is now the United States until Philadelphia in the late 18th century. Yet today, Cahokia is a quiet memory, a grassy hill rising unnaturally steep above a flat landscape. You could pass by it on the interstate and never know that an ancient metropolis lies beneath. But it was once a place of power. A mound, a calendar, a society. At the center of Cahokia stood Monk's Mound, a towering pyramid of earth 100 feet tall, covering 14 acres, larger in base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It was likely crowned with a wooden temple and reserved for the elite, a ceremonial center whose very structure reflected cosmological beliefs. Around it, a city buzzed. Rows of smaller mounds marked neighborhoods or elite residences. Broad plazas served as gathering spaces. Homes of wattle and daub lined packed earth streets. Archaeologists have unearthed pits filled with fish bones, deer antlers, smashed pottery, and the tools of daily life. These remnants speak of a complex, ordered society structured not just around survival but ceremony, astronomy, and control. North of Monk's Mound, a circle of tall wooden poles stood like sentries against time. Archaeologists called it Woodhen. These poles were aligned to mark solstices and equinoxes, tracking the sun's movement through the seasons. It was not simply a calendar. It was a symbol of order, of how humans could shape meaning from the sky. Who built these things? Who organized the labor, enforced the structure, and carried forward the beliefs that sustained them? The names are lost, but the bones tell stories. Graves of high-status individuals, buried with shell beads and exotic goods from hundreds of miles away, lie near the central mounds. Farther out, mass graves contain the remains of sacrificed individuals, young women, often with signs of violent death. This was a society where power was both spiritual and brutal. The breadbasket that fed an empire. What supported this civilization? The land itself. Cahokia sat in a region of rich floodplain, just east of the modern-day city of St. Louis. This was a breadbasket, fed by the Mississippi and its many tributaries. The people practiced intensive agriculture, focused on maize but also cultivating beans, squash, sunflower, and native seed plants like Chenopodium and Maigres species nearly lost to modern knowledge. Fields stretched beyond the city, tilled with digging sticks and stone hoes. Surplus crops fed the urban population. Clay storage pits preserved corn through the winter. Controlled burns shaped the forests. Rivers provided fish and mussels, and hunting parties brought in deer, turkey, and small game. But more than food moved here. Trade routes, stretching as far as the Great Lakes, the Gulf Coast, and the Rocky Mountains, connected Cahokia to a vast continent. Copper, mica, obsidian, marine shells each came with stories, values, and relationships. Cahokia was not isolated. It was a node in a wide and bustling network. Law and order, but whose? Was there a king, a council, a priestly class? No written records survive, and oral histories from descendant tribes, while rich, do not offer simple clarity. Some scholars argue that Cahokia was ruled by a divine chief, a figure who merged political and religious authority. Others believe power was more distributed, shaped by kinship and alliance. But the scale of the city, the centralization of labor, and the presence of elite burials suggest hierarchy, possibly steep. Control may have been exercised through cosmic narrative ritual calendars, sacred geography, and public spectacle. The placement of mounds and plazas mirrored celestial alignments. Festivals likely marked the solar cycles, binding people together through shared time. But authority could also be enforced through fear. The discovery of mass graves of sacrificed individuals, as seen in Mound 72, points to ceremonial killings, perhaps of war captives or ritual offerings. Power here was not abstract. It was felt in the body and in the soil. What they left behind. By the 1300s, Cahokia had declined. The reasons remain uncertain. Environmental degradation, political upheaval, climate change, possibly linked to the Little Ice Age, or social unrest, any or all may have played a role. Fields went fallow. The mounds ceased growing. The people dispersed. But the city was not forgotten. Its echoes survived in Mississippian traditions across the Southeast, in mound-building practices, religious symbols, and oral traditions. To the Osage, the Quapaw, the Natchez, and others, the legacy of mound-building ancestors carried weight. The land still held memory, even if the names had changed. Centuries later, French explorers would stumble across these mounds and ask who made them. The answer was not given easily. Colonial narratives would erase native achievements, casting them as simple or savage. But the ground says otherwise. The ground remembers. And so do we. Cahokia did not fall in a day. Its great mounds did not crumble like stone temples overtaken by vines. Instead, the decline was slow, incremental, marked by shifting patterns in pottery, the quiet disappearance of large gatherings, and a subtle retreat from grandeur. This was not a city sacked in fire. It was a city that slowly exhaled and then fell silent. But what happened? The slow unraveling. The first signs came between 1250 and 1300 CE. Archaeological layers reveal changes in how people lived. Houses grew farther apart. The great plazas, once bustling with ceremony, show fewer signs of heavy use. The construction of new mounds dwindled. There were fewer offerings in elite burials. It was as though the thread that once bound the city's people together had begun to fray. By around 1350, Cahokia was largely abandoned. But why? The answers are neither simple nor singular. Scholars now point to a confluence of stressors: environmental, political, and social. None in isolation would be catastrophic. Together, they reshaped a continent. Climate shifts and fragile fields. The most significant of these pressures may have been environmental. Cahokia's peak coincided with a period of agricultural prosperity known as the medieval warm period, a time when growing seasons were longer, rainfall more predictable. This made maize cultivation reliable and productive. But around the late 13th century, the climate began to change. The continent entered what's known as the Little Ice Age, a cooling trend that brought more erratic weather, floods, and droughts. For a society dependent on maize grown without plows or draft animals, this shift would have been devastating. Worse still, Cahokia's agricultural success had relied on intensive use of the surrounding landscape. Deforestation, erosion, and overuse of soils may have reduced productivity just as the climate became less forgiving. The population may have exceeded what the land could sustain. Rivers, once lifelines, may have become threats. Archaeological evidence shows signs of major floods near Cahokia during the period of decline. Crops drowned, houses washed away, fields were buried in silt. The land was no longer as generous. And when the land faltered, so did the system built upon it. Internal strain, politics, power, and people. Beyond environmental pressures, Cahokia may have faced internal political disruption. The social order rooted in religious authority, elite control, and labor tribute was effective only as long as people believed in it. But faith in leaders can be fragile. There's evidence that burials of elite individuals became more modest in the later period. The elaborate sacrifice burials of earlier times are not repeated. Did the priest chiefs lose their legitimacy? Did commoners begin to question the divine narrative? Or did a new faction challenge the old rulers? Some scholars propose that social factionalism, perhaps tied to kinship groups, rival lineages, or regional disputes, may have fractured the centralized control. Without consensus, large-scale projects like mound building or communal festivals would become difficult. Authority, once vast, may have become local and contested. And when people stopped building, they started leaving. Violence at the borders. Another possibility is conflict. While Cahokia itself was a fortified city surrounded by a wooden palisade, with watchtowers, the reasons for the wall remain debated. Some argue it was ceremonial or symbolic, but others point to a growing climate of intergroup violence across the broader Mississippian world. To the south and east, smaller mound centers show signs of warfare. Burned villages, hastily built defensive structures, arrowheads embedded in walls. It's possible that Cahokia, once a unifying center, became a lightning rod for resentment. Factions from within or pressures from without may have turned violent. Still, evidence of large-scale warfare at Cahokia itself is limited. If there was conflict, it may have been political tension rather than open battle. Or perhaps the fear of violence, rather than the violence itself, prompted communities to disperse into smaller, more defensible groups. Fear can drive people to the margins long before the sword arrives. The Great Dispersal. By the 14th century, people had begun to move away from Cahokia. Some resettled in smaller towns or in rural hamlets up and down the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. Others may have joined or influenced emerging cultures like the Oneida in the Midwest or the Etowah in the Southeast. Cultural practices didn't disappear, they diffused. Elements of Cahokian tradition, shell gorgets, iconography of birds and the underworld, mound construction techniques appear far beyond the Mississippi Valley. These were not refugees. They were carriers of memory. The mounds were left behind, but the ideas were not. Colonial misunderstanding. When Europeans arrived centuries later, they were greeted by peoples whose ancestors may have once walked Cahokia's plazas. The Osage, the Kaskaskia, the Peoria, the Tamaroa, among others. But the colonial mind, bound to its own myths, could not imagine that native peoples had built something as sophisticated as Cahokia. Some early Americans even proposed that lost races, perhaps Egyptians, Vikings, or even the 10 lost tribes of Israel had created the mounds. This erasure served a purpose. If indigenous people had not built Cahokia, then perhaps they did not truly belong to the land, a fiction that justified conquest. Only in the 20th century, through the patient work of archaeologists and tribal scholars, did the truth begin to resurface. Cahokia was native, it was local, and it was human. The echoes in the earth. Today, Monk's Mound still rises above the flat plains of Illinois. It is quiet now, a grassy hill watched by schoolchildren and passing birds, but the soil remembers. Every step across the grounds is layered with history, footsteps pressed into earth by generations of laborers, potters, farmers, and priests. The wood of the ancient palisade has long since rotted, but its imprint remains. Even in silence, Cahokia speaks. In the modern town of Collinsville, Illinois, just across the river from St. Louis, you can stand on top of Monk's Mound and look out over the floodplain. The surrounding land is flat and open, interrupted by farms, highways, and the occasional cluster of houses. To most visitors, it's just a hill, maybe a park, something odd perhaps, but not much more. But beneath your feet lies a buried city. Cahokia, once the beating heart of a continent, now lives in silence. But that silence is deceptive. Though its builders left no writing, no recorded histories, and no famous names, they left behind something perhaps more enduring, the shape of the earth itself. The story did not end with collapse. It echoed, quietly but persistently, through centuries of change. Mound builders across time. Cahokia is often referred to as the apex of the Mississippian culture, but it was not the beginning. Mound building traditions stretch back thousands of years in North America. Some of the earliest known mounds, like those at Watson Brake in Louisiana, date to around 3500 BCE, predating the Egyptian pyramids. Later, in the Ohio Valley, cultures like the Adena and Hopewell created complex earthen monuments aligned with lunar cycles and solar events. What made Cahokia different was scale. Yet even after Cahokia declined, mound building continued. Centers like Etowah in modern Georgia and Moundville in Alabama flourished for centuries. These places drew on the same symbolic language: birds, serpents, the three-tiered cosmos of sky, earth, and underworld, but adapted them to new local contexts. The mounds were more than graves or platforms. They were stories written in earth, marking the relationship between humans, ancestors, and the landscape. The building of mounds persisted long after Cahokia's plazas emptied. And in some places, they never stopped being sacred. A sacred landscape, memory, and identity. To many native communities today, such as the Osage Nation, whose ancestors likely lived in the Cahokia region, the mounds are more than historical curiosities. They are spiritual places, sites of connection to ancestors and cosmic order. Oral traditions often speak of a center place, a location where people emerged, gathered, or were taught by spiritual beings. While the names and geographic details vary, the concept resonates with what Cahokia once represented, a pivot point for time, place, and meaning. In this way, the memory of Cahokia may have survived not in a linear historical narrative, but in ritual, story, and sacred geography. The city disappeared, but its bones remained visible, and its meaning endured in other forms. Unfortunately, for centuries, these meanings were denied or dismissed by the dominant culture. Erasure, reclamation, and rediscovery. When European settlers arrived, they did not view the mounds with wonder, but with suspicion. Many assumed that native peoples could not have built such things. This belief, part ignorance, part justification for colonization, led to the myth of the mound builders. The idea that a vanished race, separate from Native Americans, had created the great earthworks of the continent. In the 19th century, even the Smithsonian Institution briefly entertained such ideas. Maps and books speculated about lost civilizations, Phoenician sailors, or mysterious giants. The truth was buried, sometimes literally, as farmers plowed through mounds, unaware or uninterested in their contents. Some mounds were destroyed completely. Others became parts of cemeteries, roadbeds, or plantations. But in the 20th century, a new approach emerged. Scientific archaeology, often led by native scholars and allies, began to uncover the actual story. Stratigraphy, radiocarbon dating, and careful excavation revealed Cahokia's timeline. The objects found, pottery, figurines, tools, told a story not of mystery, but of complexity, ingenuity, and resilience. And so, the truth began to rise again. Lessons in complexity and collapse. Cahokia's story is not just one of rise and fall. It's a reminder of how fragile urban life can be, even in the absence of obvious enemies. It asks us to consider how climate change, overpopulation, resource stress, and social inequality can unravel even the most sophisticated societies. There is no single villain in this story, no conqueror at the gate, just a gradual unraveling of systems pushed beyond their limits. In this way, Cahokia speaks to the present. We live in cities that stretch beyond what the eye can see, supported by fragile systems of transport, energy, and food. We rely on abstract authority, coordinated effort, and shared belief. What happens when those threads begin to fray? Cahokia was not destroyed, it dispersed. Its people did not vanish. They migrated, adapted, remembered. The end of a city is not the end of a culture. Modern Cahokia, what we see today. Today, Cahokia Mound State Historic Site is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, though few outside the region know it exists. You can walk through interpretive trails, climb Monk's Mound, or explore the visitor center's exhibits. On solstice mornings, visitors still gather at Woodhenge, watching the sun rise through the reconstructed poles as ancient people once did. But many of the site's mounds remain unexcavated. Their stories are still sleeping under the earth, waiting for careful hands and curious minds. Local indigenous communities have begun to reassert spiritual ties to the land, holding ceremonies, offering songs, and advocating for respectful stewardship. The work is ongoing. The legacy is alive. And the silence is not as empty as it seems. Final reflection. Cahokia reminds us that great cities can rise from clay and vanish into grass, that human achievement is not always written in stone, and that sometimes the most important stories are the ones we almost forget. We are taught to look for history in the ruins of empires and the pages of kings. But here, in a quiet field in Illinois, a people once aligned their lives with the stars, carved meaning into the earth, and built a civilization that endured not just in years but in memory. What other histories still lie beneath our feet, waiting to be remembered? Story 2. Ancestral Pueblones, the architects of stone and silence. You find yourself in a canyon. The wind moves softly through the dry air, carrying echoes of nothing in particular, just silence. Ahead, baked into the sheer face of a red sandstone cliff, are stacked walls, ancient beams, and windows shaped like eyes. It is a dwelling, or rather many dwellings carved and constructed hundreds of years ago. No one lives here now. This is Mesa Verde, or perhaps Chaco Canyon, or even Bandelier, the names vary, but the people once called themselves Hisatsinam, ancestral Pueblones, or simply the people. Their homes were made of stone, their lives of memory. Long before the arrival of Europeans, before the Spanish rode north from Mexico, before even the rise of the Aztecs, this land was alive with complex societies that thrived in the harsh, high deserts of what is now the American Southwest. They built cities into cliffs. They tracked the sun across stone. They lived in what many today would consider an impossible landscape. And then they left. A world built in stone. The ancestral Pueblones were not the only culture in the Southwest, but they were one of the most enduring and visually striking. By the 9th century CE, they had begun to build multi-room dwellings of masonry, evolving from earlier pit house traditions. But the shift wasn't just architectural, it was cultural. What began as small villages expanded into dense settlements with hundreds of rooms, many rising several stories. They built ceremonial chambers, known as kivas, round and sunken into the ground, often lined with stone and accessed by ladder through the roof. These were places of prayer, discussion, and origin stories. Nowhere was this more striking than at Chaco Canyon, located in what is now northwestern New Mexico. Between 850 and 1150 CE, Chaco Canyon became a ritual and economic center for a vast region. Its great houses, such as Pueblo Bonito, with over 600 rooms, were built with remarkable precision. Walls were aligned to solar and lunar cycles. Roads stretched for miles in straight lines across the desert, connecting Chaco to dozens of outlying communities. But these were not ordinary roads. Some were 30 feet wide, with curbs and steps carved into bedrock. No wheeled vehicles existed, no beasts of burden. These roads were for people on foot, carrying goods or ideas or both. What they moved was less important than the fact that they moved together. Living in the desert. To live in the Four Corners region where Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico meet requires adaptation. The land is beautiful but brutal, short growing seasons, long droughts, sudden floods. The ancestral Pueblones developed a deep knowledge of how to survive here. They planted maize, beans, and squash in terraced fields, sometimes using check dams and waffle gardens to trap precious rainfall. They learned to store water, to rotate crops, and to work with the soil instead of against it. They also became masters of stone and wood. The beams used in their buildings, called vigas, were often carried from forests miles away, possibly transported by coordinated labor over long distances. Some timber has been traced back to the Chusca and San Mateo Mountains, over 50 miles from Chaco. This wasn't merely resource extraction. It was an expression of control over space, an ability to shape the environment to suit human need. And yet the people also lived within limits. There were no metal tools, no draft animals. Everything was done by hand with patience, knowledge, and community. The desert was not a barren place. It was a place that taught endurance, time, memory, and ceremony. One of the most fascinating aspects of the ancestral Puebloan world was its relationship with time. Structures at Chaco Canyon are aligned with solar solstices, lunar standstills, and cardinal directions. Petroglyphs, rock carvings, mark key astronomical events. The famous sun dagger at Fajada Butte, for instance, casts a precise shaft of light through rock slabs to mark the summer solstice. These weren't just calendars. They were statements that the people were in tune with the cosmos, that they understood their place in the great turning of time. In this way, space and time were sacred. Each kiva, each doorway, was part of a larger spiritual architecture. Ceremonies, dances, and storytelling weren't entertainment. They were how memory lived. Unlike many ancient societies, the ancestral Puebloans didn't leave behind written records, but they did leave architecture, art, and aligned stone, each a kind of text, written in silence. Trade, travel, and networks. The Chaco world was not isolated. Goods from Mexico, such as macaws, copper bells, and cacao, have been found in Chacon sites. In return, the ancestral Puebloans traded turquoise, a precious stone mined from the hills of what is now New Mexico, highly valued far to the south. Obsidian from the Jemez Mountains, shells from the Pacific coast, and even pottery styles from distant regions show up in the archaeological record. The Chaco system wasn't just religious, it was economic, political, and diplomatic. Still, we don't know the precise nature of this network. Was it a centralized empire, a ritual pilgrimage center, or a coalition of autonomous communities bound by shared belief? Scholars continue to debate. What's clear is that the world the ancestral Puebloans created was not small. It stretched across deserts and mountains, united not by conquest, but by connection. A people without kings. Perhaps the most intriguing element of ancestral Puebloan society is what it didn't have. No palaces, no royal tombs, no depictions of rulers. Unlike Mesoamerican empires which celebrated divine kingship, the people of Chaco and Mesa Verde left no clear signs of hierarchical rule. Leadership may have been communal, based on clans, councils, or religious offices. Power may have rotated, been shared, or disguised within ceremonial roles. This is, perhaps, why their story is harder to tell. We are trained to look for empires, for battles, for rulers. But here, the story is quieter, of farmers, builders, astronomers, and dancers, of people who lived with the land, not over it. And then, like Cahokia, they left. The mystery of the ancestral Puebloans is not in their silence, it's in their departure. By the late 1200s, the high mesas, great canyons, and grand stone cities of the Southwest were being gradually abandoned. Chaco Canyon, once a hub of astronomical alignment and architectural wonder, was no longer a bustling ceremonial center. The great cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde were vacated. Kayenta, Cibola, and Bandelier all show similar signs of movement, villages emptying, plazas going quiet, homes left behind with tools still in them. But why, and where did everyone go? These are questions that modern archaeology has tried to answer, not with dramatic collapses, but with layered causes and soft departures. The truth is not a sudden vanishing. It's a story of movement, adaptation, and the slow unraveling of something once intricate. The drought years. One key to understanding the abandonment of the central pueblos is the climate. Dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, shows that the late 13th century was marked by a prolonged drought, specifically between 1276 and 1299, now known as the Great Drought. This was a time when rain failed to fall with regularity, crops withered, stored corn may have run low, springs and seeps dried. For a people deeply dependent on rainfall agriculture, this would have meant existential uncertainty. In the high elevation sites of Mesa Verde, where growing seasons were already short and water scarce, this stress would have been particularly acute. The climate alone, however, does not tell the full story. Droughts had occurred before, people had adapted, so what made this time different? Fractures in the social fabric. It is one thing to survive a drought when the community is unified. It is another when internal tensions are brewing. Evidence from later sites, including burned structures, mass graves, and hastily fortified villages, suggests that this period may have been marked by social fragmentation, raiding, or even intercommunity violence. Archaeologists have found signs of palisaded hilltop settlements, defensible and often remote, rising in frequency after the abandonment of the major population centers. Some pueblos seem to have been destroyed, deliberately burned, sealed, or filled in, suggesting that their end was neither accidental nor purely natural. Was this civil unrest, competing factions, a collapse of ceremonial authority, or merely groups of people making hard decisions in desperate times? What's clear is that the elaborate coordination seen in places like Chaco, shared building styles, road networks, ritual alignments began to break down. Local communities turned inward. Regional integration faded. A world once built on cosmic unity began to fracture into smaller, more isolated responses to crisis. Leaving the cliffs behind. One of the most iconic images of the ancestral pueblones is that of cliff dwellings like Cliff Palace or Spruce Tree House in Mesa Verde, carefully tucked into natural alcoves beneath overhanging rock. These were not permanent homes. Most were occupied for only a few generations, and yet they required immense effort, harvesting stone, wood, and mortar, transporting water, climbing to fields on the mesa top above. So why build in such precarious places? Some suggest it was defensive, a response to growing tensions and threats. Others see it as ritual, symbolizing closeness to the sacred or the ancestral underworld. But by the end of the 1200s, even these fortified homes were being left behind. Entire communities walked away from their cliff palaces and moved southward, toward what is now Arizona, New Mexico, and northern Mexico. There, they built new villages not in cliffs, but on plains near rivers, often in more defensible formations. This movement was not a disappearance, but a relocation. The people did not vanish, they adapted. Survival through transformation. In the aftermath of the Great Drought and social upheaval, the cultural descendants of the ancestral pueblones reestablished themselves in new ways. Villages in places like Hopi, Zuni, and the Rio Grande Pueblos grew in size and complexity. Here, new ceremonial systems emerged: Kachina rituals, masked dances, oral histories, and creation stories that wove together the threads of the past with the needs of a changing present. Some traditions were preserved, others were reinvented. The Kachina belief system, for example, reflects a world structured around balance, reciprocity, and community responsibility. It is not a religion of empire or kingship, but one of cycles of the sun, the seasons, the harvest, and the rain. It is tempting to think of this as a simplification. In reality, it was a transformation. A society that had once aligned its buildings to the moon now aligned its ceremonies to communal renewal. This too is resilience. Memory in the landscape. Though the central cities of Chaco and Mesa Verde were abandoned, they were not forgotten. Many modern Pueblo peoples maintain cultural and spiritual connections to these ancestral sites. Pilgrimages, songs, and ceremonies still reference the places before the emergence points and the sacred architecture of earlier generations. For the Hopi, Zuni, and other Pueblo communities, the cliffs and canyons are part of a sacred geography, not ruins, but living spaces where time folds in on itself. Stories told today speak of migration, struggle, guidance from spirit beings, and the eventual arrival in the current villages. These are not historical narratives as we define them, but cosmic histories, where place and time are inseparable. To look at Chaco Canyon or Mesa Verde as mere archaeological sites is to misread them. They are portals of memory, colonial eyes, and misunderstandings. When Spanish colonists entered the region in the 16th century, they encountered Pueblo communities living in compact, orderly villages farming, weaving, and practicing seasonal ceremonies. The Spanish were struck by the apparent simplicity of the people, not realizing they were the descendants of a once vast cultural web that had deliberately chosen sustainability over spectacle. Some Spanish friars recorded glimpses of older traditions, deities of rain and corn, dances timed to the solstice, but dismissed them as idolatry. The Puebloans, in turn, responded with resistance and adaptation. In 1680, they carried out the Pueblo Revolt, successfully expelling Spanish settlers for over a decade, a rare moment of indigenous success in the colonial era. This too was a lesson inherited from their ancestors. When the center no longer serves, move, adapt, and endure. As the dust settles in the high desert and the heat shimmers off ancient stone, the great dwellings of the ancestral Puebloans still hold firm, silent witnesses to centuries of change. Yet for all their seeming permanence, they are not the center of the story anymore. The true continuation of the ancestral Puebloan world lives not in the ruins of Chaco Canyon or the cliff alcoves of Mesa Verde, but in the songs, dances, and language of the modern Pueblo peoples in Hopi, Zuni, Taos, Acoma, and many others. And this is where we must look to understand how a civilization can continue without monuments, and how memory can become a more enduring architecture than stone. The living descendants. Today, 19 federally recognized Pueblo communities remain in New Mexico, with others in Arizona and Texas. These are not remnants or relics. They are active, sovereign communities maintaining traditional practices in the face of centuries of colonialism, assimilation pressure, and land loss. Among them, the Hopi of Arizona are often regarded as particularly connected to the ancestral migrations. Their four-cornered cosmology, their clan-based social system, and their annual ceremonial calendar all reflect values rooted in the past. The Zuni, too, maintain a distinct language and rich ceremonial life. Their stories speak of migrations, sacred lakes, and the middle place, where people were meant to settle in harmony with the world. And then there are the Rio Grande Pueblos like Taos, Santa Clara, Isleta, and San Ildefonso, who adapted to Spanish presence with both resistance and resilience, preserving ancient practices behind adobe walls, within family lines, and beneath the surface of Catholic overlays. These communities carry on traditions of dry farming, pottery, weaving, and kiva ceremonies, not as reenactments but as continuations. The ancestral Puebloans never disappeared. They became their future. The language of survival. There is a quiet genius in how the Pueblo world has endured. Where great empires often seek power through expansion, wealth, and conquest, the Pueblo ethos emphasizes balance, reciprocity, and place. Their stories are not of rulers, but of origins, obligations, and relations with the non-human world: corn, wind, rain, and the spirits of the underworld. The Kachina tradition, central to many Pueblo ceremonies, introduces a pantheon of spiritual beings who represent aspects of nature and human behavior. These beings are not worshipped, but honored through dances, storytelling, and communal ritual. The community becomes a theater of the sacred, with masked dancers channeling forces beyond words. This is not myth in the Western sense. It is a system of knowledge, ecological, moral, and spiritual, encoded in story and symbol. That this system has survived conquest, missionization, forced schooling, and modern economic pressures is extraordinary. The role of place. For Pueblo peoples, place is not passive. It is an active participant in identity. To leave one's land is to lose part of oneself. To plant corn in the same field as one's ancestors is not just tradition, it is ceremony. This deep-rooted attachment to place explains the resilience of Pueblo villages. While much of the continent saw waves of displacement, relocation, and cultural disintegration, many Pueblo communities have remained in the same locations for hundreds of years. Taos Pueblo, for example, is among the oldest continuously inhabited settlements in North America, with structures that date back over 1,000 years. It is not a museum, it is home. And yet, this rootedness does not imply stagnation. Pueblo societies have adapted technologies, negotiated with governments, and integrated modern schooling and professions, all while maintaining their own frameworks of meaning. That balancing act between continuity and change is the true architecture of their survival. Archaeology and indigenous knowledge. In the past, archaeological work on ancestral Puebloan sites was often done without consulting descendant communities. Mounds were excavated, artifacts removed, sacred sites treated as puzzles rather than as places of reverence. Today, this is slowly changing. Many Pueblo nations now work directly with archaeologists, helping to guide research questions, protect sacred places, and repatriate remains and items under laws like NAGPRA, Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. This collaboration represents not just ethical progress, but a rebalancing of narratives. Where earlier generations of scholars asked, "Why did they disappear?" Pueblo voices now respond, "We didn't." Echoes for the present. The story of the ancestral Puebloans and their descendants is more than a historical curiosity. It is a lens for considering what it means to endure. In a world facing climate change, resource depletion, and cultural disconnection, their legacy reminds us that survival is not always about expansion. Sometimes, it is about learning to live within limits, honoring place, and remembering the cycles of time. They chose, when the old systems failed, to walk away from grandeur and return to something smaller, more communal, more rooted. They redefined resilience not as maintaining dominance, but as adapting in relationship with the land. And that in itself may be one of the most profound lessons of all. Final reflection. The ancestral Puebloans teach us that not all collapses are endings. Some are transformations, silent choices to leave behind the great and the grand, in favor of the quiet and the enduring. In their silence, they speak to us still. What other voices from the past might we hear, if we learn to listen not for kings or battles but for stone aligned to sun, footsteps worn into canyon trails, and the humble architecture of memory? Story 3. The Mississippian Calendar, Keeping Time with the Sky. It is an early morning on the open plains near what is now Cahokia, and the horizon is painted in soft pinks and cool grays. Before you, set into the landscape with careful intention, stand tall wooden posts, arranged in a near-perfect circle rising from the grass like forgotten sentinels. As the sun crests the eastern edge of the sky, a shadow falls exactly where it should. This is Woodhenge, and though it may seem simple, just posts in a field, it was once one of the most important instruments in the pre-Columbian world, a calendar, a clock, and a cosmic stage. Before telescopes, before compasses, before printed calendars or smart devices, the peoples of the Mississippian world, like the builders of Cahokia, watched the sky with precision and patience. They needed no gears or glass lenses. They had the land, the sun, and the knowledge passed down over generations. This is the story of how time was kept not in seconds or minutes, but in seasons, stars, and sacred alignments. A system both practical and profound. The Woodhenge of Cahokia. Near the western edge of Cahokia's core lies a reconstructed circle of tall red cedar posts, originally discovered in the 1960s by archaeologist Warren Witry. He named it Woodhenge, after the more famous stone circle in England, but this was no imitation. The original structure likely consisted of 30 to 60 wooden posts, forming a circle over 400 feet in diameter. Several woodhenges were built over time, with variations in size and layout, but their purpose remained the same: to track celestial events. From the center of the circle, the placement of certain posts allowed observers to mark the rising sun on the solstices and equinoxes. On the summer solstice, for example, the sun would rise directly behind one post, on the winter solstice, behind another. This alignment wasn't accidental. It was engineered not just for knowledge, but for ritual. Imagine standing at the circle's center on a frigid December morning, watching the sun align behind the winter solstice post. Around you, priests, leaders, and commoners gather. Fires crackle. The shortest day of the year begins, and with it, a new cycle. The heavens affirm the calendar, and the people are reminded the world still turns. Why the sky mattered. To the Mississippian people, astronomy was not abstract. It was life management, agricultural planning, religious validation, and social coordination all in one. The movements of the sun, moon, and stars structured the entire year. When to plant corn, when to begin rituals, when to honor the dead, when to gather for trade, games, or communal labor. Without writing systems or clocks, the sky became a living document, read each day and interpreted by trained observers, likely priests or spiritual elites. These individuals would have held both scientific and religious authority, using their astronomical knowledge to reinforce social power. In this way, the calendar was cosmic and political. To control time was to control belief. Beyond Cahokia, calendars across the Mississippian world. Cahokia's Woodhenge is the most famous example, but evidence of solar and lunar alignments appears across the Mississippian sphere. At Poverty Point in Louisiana, earthworks suggest astronomical considerations in their construction, even centuries before Cahokia's peak. Moundville in Alabama shows signs of ceremonial timing aligned with seasonal changes. In Georgia, at the Ocmulgee Mounds, platform mounds were likely used to observe equinox events. Farther north, at the Angel Mound site in Indiana, central plazas and mound arrangements seem to reflect deliberate cardinal alignments. Though separated by hundreds of miles, these societies were connected by a shared cosmological vision, one that saw time, earth, and sky as interdependent. And through it, they maintained social cohesion, even across diverse geographies and languages. The three worlds of Mississippian belief. To understand their calendar, we must also understand their cosmology. Mississippian spiritual life was structured around three interconnected worlds. The upper world associated with the sky, order, and celestial bodies like the sun and falcon. The middle world, the world of humans, corn, rivers, and everyday life. The underworld, a watery realm of chaos, transformation, and powerful beings like the horned serpent. These layers were not separate in daily life, they were intertwined. The calendar, then, was not just a farming tool. It was a bridge, a way to align human action with the forces above and below. Major ceremonies likely took place on celestial hinges, equinoxes, and solstices when the boundaries between worlds were thinner. Aligning mounds, plazas, and wood hinges to the sun's path wasn't just about marking time. It was about maintaining balance between worlds, keeping the cosmos in harmony. Sun and sovereignty. Mississippian leaders, sometimes called sun chiefs, may have drawn their legitimacy from this cosmic connection. The sun, giver of life, was not just worshipped, it was embodied in leadership. Monk's Mound at Cahokia, for example, was positioned not randomly, but precisely aligned with the central wood hinge. Some scholars argue that important rituals involved a chief or priest ascending the mound at sunrise, visible to thousands gathered below. A theatrical moment, linking political authority with the heavens. This use of solar alignment to reinforce human authority echoes similar practices in Mesoamerican civilizations like the Maya or Aztecs, though the Mississippian world had its own distinct expressions. The calendar wasn't just observed, it was performed. Everyday timekeeping. But while Woodhenge served ceremonial and elite functions, timekeeping in everyday life was also essential. Agricultural cycles required careful tracking. Tools like shadow sticks, landmarks, or even specific animal behaviors may have been used to mark seasonal shifts. Knowledge was often held orally, passed down by elders or ritual specialists. In a world without clocks, people learned to tell time by the position of the sun, the length of shadows, the angle of starlight, and the pattern of frost on the grass. This intimacy with the land and sky created a form of relational time not fixed by mechanical precision, but deeply attuned to the rhythms of the world. Time was not something kept on the wrist. It was walked, planted, sung, and danced. The Mississippian calendar was more than a practical tool. It was the foundation of a worldview, woven into ceremony, urban planning, and the social imagination. To track time in this world was not merely to count days, it was to participate in an ongoing sacred rhythm, where the heavens gave shape to human action and divine will. The great cities of the Mississippian culture like Cahokia, Etowah, Spiro, and Moundville were not just places to live. They were cosmological blueprints, carefully constructed to reflect the movement of the stars and the structure of the universe as the people understood it. And at the center of these blueprints was the idea that human behavior must mirror cosmic order. Aligning cities with the sky. Archaeological research has revealed that Mississippian cities were not laid out haphazardly. Their mounds, plazas, and causeways were often oriented to cardinal directions, especially east, west, and north, south axes. These alignments weren't just aesthetic, they were spiritual. The rising and setting of the sun played a central role. In some sites, mounds appear to be placed so that at key points in the year, such as the summer or winter solstice, the sun would rise or set over a specific mound when viewed from a particular plaza or ceremonial space. At Cahokia, for instance, the alignment between Monk's Mound and Woodhenge may have created visual spectacles during equinoxes and solstices, reinforcing the idea that the society itself was tuned to the cosmic clock. Some mound complexes had 4 mounds placed at cardinal points surrounding a plaza, possibly representing the 4 sacred directions, each associated with particular colors, animals, or elemental forces. In this way, the cities became living calendars, and walking through them was to walk through time itself. The ritual year, ceremonies, and agricultural time. While we have no written Mississippian calendars, we can infer much from oral traditions, archaeological patterns, and comparisons with descendant communities like the southeastern tribes such as the Muskogee, Creek, Choctaw, Cherokee, and Natchez. A key event in the yearly cycle was the green corn ceremony, likely a first fruits festival tied to the ripening of maize, a central crop across the Mississippian world. This ritual marked the end of the old year and the beginning of the new. It involved fasting, cleansing, dancing, games, and the renewal of fire, literally extinguishing old hearths, and relighting them from a central sacred flame. The ceremony likely corresponded to the late summer solstice season, or the beginning of harvest, and emphasized purification, gratitude, and social harmony. Other ceremonies may have been aligned with spring planting, autumn transition, or midwinter renewal. Each part of the agricultural cycle required specific prayers, songs, and ritual behaviors often tied to the position of celestial bodies. In this way, the calendar was not just a measure of time, it was a framework for right living, encoded with ethical and spiritual expectations. The role of ritual specialists. Such a complex calendar required trained observers. These may have been priests, elders, or ritual specialist figures who served as timekeepers, intercessors, and interpreters of the cosmic order. Their roles may have included observing sunrise and moonrise at marked points on the horizon, maintaining ceremonial fires, deciding when to plant or harvest, determining when ceremonies should be held, instructing others in the symbolism of rituals. These individuals likely held significant political power, though not necessarily in the way of monarchs. Instead, their influence would come from their access to knowledge, especially knowledge that ensured the society remained aligned with the heavens. And because time was sacred, controlling its reckoning meant controlling the rhythm of life. Time and burial, marking the eternal. Another aspect of Mississippian timekeeping appears in their burial practices, especially at sites like Mound 72 at Cahokia. There, archaeologists uncovered a highly elaborate burial site containing a central elite male buried on a platform of 20,000 shell beads, arranged in the shape of a bird, possibly a thunderbird, symbol of the upper world. Dozens of sacrificed individuals, mostly young women, buried nearby, possibly as ritual companions or offerings. Several other mass graves, some with signs of violence, others with careful placement. While these burials are deeply troubling by modern standards, they reflect a society in which death was closely tied to cosmological cycles. The placement of bodies, the orientation of graves, and the grave goods themselves may have been chosen to reflect the calendar, the seasons, or the sacred directions. In this sense, burial was not the end of time, it was a continuation of cosmic roles in another world, a way of marking eternity with ritual precision. Tracking the moon and the stars. While solar alignments are the most obvious, there is evidence that the Mississippian calendar also tracked the moon, and perhaps even Venus or specific star clusters. The lunar cycle, especially the 19-year lunar standstill, is a difficult phenomenon to observe, but important in many indigenous traditions. Some archaeologists believe that certain mound sites may reflect these longer lunar cycles, suggesting a level of astronomical sophistication not often credited to native societies. Why the moon? Because it governs night, water, and fertility, and in Mississippian cosmology, these were underworld domains, necessary counterparts to the sunlit world. The balance of sun and moon, light and darkness, sky and earth, was not a philosophical abstraction. It was the template of life. The sound of time, music, dance, and memory. For a people without writing, timekeeping was also embodied, remembered through movement, sound, and ritual performance. Ceremonies likely involved chant cycles repeated at key times, drumming rhythms to mark the passage of ceremonial moments, dances that symbolized agricultural cycles, mythic stories, or cosmic balance. Time was lived through body and community, reaffirmed not by a written date, but by the act of doing. In this way, each year was not new. It was a return, a spiral of time, always circling back, each turn deepening collective memory. In the final centuries before European contact, the great cities of the Mississippian world began to fade. The astronomical alignments that once synchronized rituals, agriculture and political power grew quiet. Mounds stopped growing. Fires went out in the sacred plazas. Wood hinges collapsed and rotted where they stood. The sky, still moving in its ancient patterns, no longer found its echo in the cities below. But the calendar didn't vanish. It changed shape. It followed the people as they moved south and east into new landscapes and smaller villages. It lived on in oral traditions, in seasonal ceremonies, and in the ritualized movement of bodies in dance and prayer. The sky was no longer measured by giant circles of timber, but by the memories of elders, the songs of communities, and the shadows cast on cornfields. And so the calendar became invisible but never gone. The dispersal of timekeeping traditions. As Cahokia and its peers declined, likely due to a combination of environmental change, resource strain, social upheaval, and perhaps even spiritual disillusionment, the complex Mississippian world fragmented. People moved outward. They joined or formed new societies, including the ancestors of the Natchez, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Caddo, among others. In each case, elements of the old calendar and ceremonial year reappeared in new forms. Among the Natchez, French colonists observed a chief known as the Great Sun, who ruled with priestly authority and was ritually connected to solar symbolism, an echo of Mississippian sun chiefs. The green corn ceremony, found across the southeast, retained much of the seasonal rhythm of earlier calendars, marking renewal, harvest, and the moral cleansing of the community. Directional symbolism, with associated colors, spirits, and duties, remained embedded in council structures and ceremonial grounds. These traditions weren't fossilized. They were living calendars adapted, reimagined, but always rooted in the sacred geometry of time. Contact and disruption. When European colonizers arrived in the 16th and 17th centuries, they brought more than guns and disease. They brought a different concept of time. Mechanical clocks, Christian liturgical calendars, agricultural schedules tied to colonial markets rather than the solstices, days named for saints, months organized by decree. This new time was linear, uniform, and external, a thing to be imposed on bodies and labor. For indigenous peoples who had lived by seasonal cycles, oral timing, and celestial relationships, the shift was profound. In many areas, native timekeeping traditions were suppressed or ridiculed. Ceremonies were banned, sacred fires extinguished, elders lost their students, priests lost their calendars. But the sky, uncaring, kept moving. And some communities continued to follow it quietly. Survival in silence. In places where indigenous traditions survived colonial pressure, the ancient rhythms persisted, though often out of sight. Ceremonies were hidden behind church walls, masked in Catholic feast days. Calendars were kept in memory, passed from generation to generation in secret. Seasonal rituals were adapted to modern life, retaining core meaning even as language and tools changed. Among the Muskogee Creek and other southeastern peoples, the green corn ceremony continues to be practiced, often in remote ceremonial grounds, off-limits to outsiders. Time is still marked by the ripening of corn, the position of stars, and the needs of the earth. This isn't nostalgia, it's resistance. The calendar is still a tool not just to plant and harvest, but to remember, to organize, and to assert that another rhythm still exists. Archaeology and recognition. In the 20th and 21st centuries, archaeologists and indigenous scholars began to reconstruct the sophistication of Mississippian timekeeping. Advanced software, archaeoastronomy, and new excavations revealed just how precise these ancient systems were. Post-hole alignments, solar markers, and even sight lines through mounds were mapped to match equinoxes, solstices, and lunar standstills. The builders of Cahokia and other sites were not guessing. They were measuring, planning, and calibrating over generations. These discoveries challenge old assumptions that pre-contact North American societies lacked science or cosmology. Instead, they reveal a world where science, spirituality, and society were interwoven, not divided. And perhaps they invite us to rethink our own sense of time. Lessons from a forgotten calendar. Today, we live by divided time. Time of labor, time of leisure, school time, fiscal quarters, daylight savings, meeting time, time that rushes, fragments, and eludes us. But the Mississippian calendar offers a different model. Time tied to place, not productivity. Time that honors cycles, not progress. Time as sacred, not scarce. It reminds us that human life was once measured by the path of the sun, the green of the corn, and the dance of stars across the night sky. That time could still be ours if we choose to listen. Final reflection. The Mississippian peoples marked time not with ticking seconds, but with shifting shadows, turning seasons, and the movement of the heavens. Their calendar, now silent in the fields, once aligned cities, lives, and spirits with the cosmos. What might it mean today to once again let the sky tell us when to begin? Story 4. Timbisha in the Valley of Death. Life in a land without rain. Before it was known as Death Valley, this vast, searing basin was a home. It bore no name in English nor carried warnings on maps. It was simply part of the world, a place where mountains rose sharply from salt flats, where summer temperatures boiled the ground, and where winter offered no true relief. It was harsh. It was dry. It was, by all appearances, uninhabitable. But the people who lived here, the Timbisha Shoshone, did not see it that way. To them, this land was Tumpissa, rock paint, named for the red ochre found in the region's canyons, used for generations in ceremony and adornment. It was not empty. It was not death. It was alive with rules and rhythms, and it was theirs. Long before gold prospectors staggered across the desert in the 19th century, and before maps branded it with foreboding titles, the Timbisha had lived here for at least 1,000 years, and likely far longer. They survived not through defiance of the desert, but through understanding it, its resources, its signs, and its silence. This is their story, a history of resilience without rain, and of knowledge shaped not in cities or temples, but among rocks, wind, and enduring memory. The geography of scarcity. Death Valley is one of the hottest and driest places on Earth. Nestled between the Amargosa Range and the Panamint Mountains, it plunges to Badwater Basin, 282 feet below sea level. In summer, temperatures routinely rise above 120 degrees F, 49 degrees C. Rain may not fall for months. The soil is alkaline, the air oppressive. Yet even here, life persists if you know where to look. Small springs seep from canyon walls. Shallow seeps collect at the base of rock outcrops. Mesquite trees, desert holly, and creosote bush cluster around seasonal water. These are not accidents. The land signals where sustenance lies if one listens long enough. The Timbisha understood these signals. Over generations, they mapped them not on parchment, but in story, movement, and memory. Their villages were located near water sources Furnace Creek, Mesquite Spring, and Wildrose Canyon, among others. Not large settlements, but seasonal camps, mobile and adaptable. Their economy was based on foraging, hunting, and seasonal migration. They gathered pine nuts, mesquite beans, seeds, roots, and cactus fruits. They hunted rabbits, desert bighorn, and occasionally antelope in higher elevations. The desert did not offer abundance, but it offered enough. A language of place. Timbisha, the language of the people, is part of the Numic branch of the Uto-Aztecan language family spoken across the Great Basin and western United States. It is a language rooted in movement, landscape, and observation. In Timbisha, places are often named not just for what they are, but for how they feel, what they offer, or how they change with time. A wash might be called where water sometimes comes. A canyon might be named for the echo it makes at sunset. A spring might be known by the plants that bloom nearby. This was not poetry. It was navigation, survival, and science in linguistic form. Through this language, children were taught to read the land, to recognize a change in bird calls, to note the shimmer of heat that meant water was near, to know which plants could be eaten raw and which must be roasted in stone-lined pits. Time, too, was marked not by hours, but by seasons of bloom, ripening, migration, and quiet. Housing and material life. In such an extreme environment, architecture had to follow the rules of nature. Timbisha homes were brush shelters, called kisu, made from mesquite, willow, or arrowweed low to the ground, circular or oval, with open airflow for ventilation in the brutal heat. In colder months or at higher elevations, semi-subterranean houses were used, taking advantage of the insulating properties of the earth. Clothing was simple: bark fibers, animal skins, and later, trade cloth. Tools were made from stone, bone, and wood, designed with efficiency in mind. Cooking was typically done outdoors or in earth ovens, where hot stones baked tubers, seeds, and small game. Water was precious, used sparingly, and carried in woven baskets lined with pitch or clay jars acquired through trade. Everything had a purpose, and very little was wasted. Scarcity bred precision. A single miscalculation using water too freely, harvesting a plant too early, could spell hardship. But over generations, knowledge accumulated, and with it, sustainability. Spiritual knowledge and the land. The Timbisha world was not divided into sacred and mundane. The entire land was sacred. Rocks held memory. Springs held spirit. Animals were kin. Certain mountains were avoided not out of fear but out of respect. Stories told by elders explained how coyote shaped the world, how rabbit brought fire, how tricksters and sky beings still walked among the shadows of the hills. Ceremony was not centralized. There were no temples or grand rituals. Instead, small-scale observances, songs, offerings, and seasonal markers connected the people to the cycles of nature and the responsibilities of living well. Everything: eating, walking, harvesting, resting was part of a moral economy. Take only what is needed, thank the source, and leave enough for others, including non-human life. This was a system of knowledge not written, but performed, spoken, and lived. A network of movement. Though the Timbisha lived in what appears to outsiders as isolation, they were part of a regional network of trade, kinship, and migration. To the west lay Paiute groups in the Owens Valley. To the north and east, Shoshone, Panamint, and Western Mono peoples. To the south, connections extended toward Cahuilla and Mohave lands. Items like obsidian, shell beads, woven goods, basketry, and even salt were exchanged through these networks. Trade was often seasonal, and relationships were maintained through marriage, visits, and reciprocal hospitality. In this way, the Timbisha were never truly alone. They were part of a moving web of desert and mountain societies, each adapted to its unique environment, each contributing a piece to the greater whole. The modern visitor to Death Valley often arrives by car, clutching bottled water and sunscreen, hopping for a photograph near the salt flats or sand dunes. To many, this land is a backdrop for survivalist fantasy or geological wonder. But for the Timbisha, the desert was never a test. It was a teacher. Every rock, wind pattern, and plant behavior was part of an environmental script, rehearsed and memorized over generations. It was not a place to conquer. It was a place to listen. This section explores how the Timbisha developed an intimate knowledge of ecology, adaptation, and resilience, and how they carried that knowledge into the turbulent era of European-American colonization, holding onto memory even as the land around them was taken and renamed. Seasonal movements and ecological timing. While the valley floor could reach deadly temperatures in summer, the Timbisha were never sedentary. Their lives followed the natural elevation gradient of the region, a form of vertical migration that took them from the scorching basin in summer to higher, cooler elevations in winter and spring. Spring brought foraging in mid-elevation canyons, where melting snow fed temporary streams. Early greens and roots could be gathered. Summer required movement to higher elevations in the Panamint Mountains, where piñón pine nuts, berries, and game were more abundant. Fall was the season of nut gathering, especially the piñón harvest, a crucial source of fat and calories, processed and stored carefully. Winter brought families down again into more sheltered areas like Furnace Creek Wash and Warm Springs, where resources were cached and communal life resumed. This cycle wasn't unique to the Timbisha, but few followed it under such extreme conditions. This was more than seasonal adjustment, it was a calibrated, cultural adaptation, fine-tuned to environmental shifts most people today might miss entirely. A shift in bloom, a delay in animal movement, a change in the wind direction, each was a cue in an ongoing dialogue with the land. Food as knowledge. Survival in Death Valley depended on deep botanical and zoological understanding. The Timbisha diet drew from a wide variety of sources. Plants. Mesquite beans were collected and ground into flour. These pods were nutritious, sweet, and storable. Cactus fruits and yucca blossoms offered sugar and fiber. Scrubine mesquite, despite its odd appearance, was prized and used in both food and medicine. Chia seeds, gathered from desert plants, were known for their hydration properties and sometimes carried on long treks. Cooking techniques. Earth ovens were built by heating stones in a pit, adding roots or meat wrapped in leaves, and covering the whole thing with earth to trap heat. This slow cook could take hours, but it extracted every bit of energy from the ingredients. Leaching pits were used to make otherwise inedible seeds or roots safe, by removing toxins, a process that might take days, requiring precise timing and local knowledge. Water management. Water was not fetched, it was found, often hidden beneath dry creek beds, where digging just a few feet could yield a trickle. Springs were carefully tended and shared. A person who polluted a spring was not just careless, they were seen as endangering everyone's future. This was not subsistence living. It was a form of ecological stewardship built on cooperation and observation. Climate variability and adaptation. The desert climate is not just hot, it is unstable. Periods of drought might be followed by sudden floods, a fact that shaped every aspect of Timbisha life. To survive in a land where predictability was rare, the people learned to develop flexibility rather than rigidity. This meant diversifying food sources, never relying on just one or two plants or animals, storing surplus in strategic places across their territory, maintaining social ties across neighboring groups to enable resource sharing in lean years. This flexibility was embedded in cultural values. Pride came not in accumulation, but in generosity, especially during times of shortage. The desert taught that what you keep can't always save you, but what you share just might. The coming of strangers. In the mid-1800s, the isolation of the Timbisha world began to unravel. Gold and silver discoveries in California and Nevada drew waves of fortune seekers into the region. In 1849, a group of immigrants lost and desperate passed through what is now Death Valley. Several died. The survivors, upon leaving, supposedly uttered, "Goodbye, Death Valley." The name stuck. To the Timbisha, this was both a misreading and a prophecy. The land had sustained them, but now, under new eyes, it became a symbol of hardship, a wasteland to be overcome. With settlers came conflict. Water sources were claimed or diverted. Piñón forests were cut for fuel. Hunting grounds were enclosed or mined. In 1933, the area was declared a national monument, eventually becoming Death Valley National Park. The Timbisha were still there living in Furnace Creek, maintaining their traditions, but they were officially invisible. Park management viewed them as squatters. Their homes were bulldozed, their access to sacred places restricted, their story erased from the brochures. The land of their ancestors was now federal land, and the people were told it was no longer theirs. Holding on through story. But even as the land changed hands, the Timbisha did not vanish. They held on through oral tradition, seasonal practices, and community memory. Children were still taught the old ways. How to find water by following the songs of certain birds. How to move across the desert by walking at dawn and dusk. How to tell which cacti bore fruit and which were best left untouched. They kept speaking Timbisha even when schools tried to suppress it. They gathered for ceremonies even when told not to. They continued to refer to their homeland not as Death Valley, but as Tumpasa, the place of red paint. These acts of continuity were not accidental. They were resistance strategies, passed quietly from hand to hand. By the end of the 20th century, the Timbisha Shoshone had lived in the region we now call Death Valley for more than 1,000 years, and yet they were still fighting to be seen. In the land of their ancestors, where they had tracked stars, gathered pine nuts, and walked stone trails older than the United States, they were labeled squatters. In the heart of a national park built over their homeland, they were treated as visitors. But their story did not end with removal. It continued with return. This section tells the story of persistence in the face of erasure, of quiet survival and eventual recognition, and of what it means to reclaim not just territory but meaning. The long struggle for recognition. The Timbisha Shoshone never signed a treaty with the U.S. government. They were never officially removed, but for most of the 20th century, they were also never formally recognized, a legal limbo that left them without rights to their own land, water, or even housing. From the 1930s onward, families lived in and around Furnace Creek, a historic village within the boundaries of Death Valley National Monument, later National Park. They continued gathering traditional foods, maintaining ceremonies, and speaking their language, but under constant threat of displacement. Park officials demolished homes and restricted access to ancestral springs and pinyon groves. Meanwhile, tourists drove through the desert, unaware that the land beneath their tires held centuries of memory. Beginning in the 1970s, Timbisha elders, especially figures like Pauline Esteves and Barbara Durham, began a long campaign for federal recognition and land rights. They were not activists in the modern sense. They were cultural stewards fighting for continuity. Their message was simple. We never left, we are still here, this is our land. Recognition and return. After decades of petitions, legal advocacy, and community organizing, a turning point came. In 1982, the Timbisha were granted federal recognition, a status affirming their identity as a sovereign tribe. But recognition alone did not restore land. The final breakthrough came in 2000, when the U.S. Congress passed the Timbisha Shoshone Homeland Act. For the first time in over a century, the tribe received a 7,500-acre trust land base, including part of their historical homeland, the right to build homes and facilities at Furnace Creek, cultural protections for sacred sites within the larger Death Valley National Park. It was a rare moment in American history. A people whose land had been taken by preservation policy, not war or settlement, was finally welcomed back, not just symbolically, but legally. And they came home. Cultural revitalization in a new century. Today, the Timbisha Shoshone tribe maintains a small but enduring presence at Furnace Creek. The village includes homes, a tribal office, and cultural programs aimed at preserving language, craft, and ecological knowledge. Children learn Timbisha vocabulary. Elders teach traditional plant use, song cycles, and basket weaving. Community members still collect mesquite pods, still walk the canyons, still pray at springs. The tribe has worked with the National Park Service, not always without tension, but with a shared recognition that the desert is both natural space and cultural homeland. Unlike tourist interpretations, which often cast Death Valley as empty, dead, or barren, the Timbisha tell a different story, a story of presence, abundance, and kinship with place. They show us that even in the most extreme environments, culture can take root and endure. The desert as teacher. The modern world tends to view deserts as obstacles, places to cross, extract from, or escape. But for the Timbisha, the desert has always been a source of knowledge. It teaches attention, because to miss a signal could mean thirst. It teaches humility, because no one can command the desert. It teaches patience, because growth here is slow but deep. It also teaches cooperation. No one survives alone in Death Valley. Every success is communal. Every mistake is shared. These lessons, born in sand and heat, may be more relevant now than ever. In a time of environmental strain and social fragmentation, the Timbisha story offers a model not of conquest, but of adaptation, observation, and endurance. From margins to center, Death Valley may have been named to signal danger and failure, but for the Timbisha, it was always home. For them, Tumpisa was a center, a place not of death, but of ceremony, life, and meaning. Their survival is not dramatic. It is not marked by grand wars or famous monuments. It is marked instead by continuity, a language still spoken, stories still told, roots still walked, and plants still gathered in the same canyons where their ancestors once sang. That is the power of quiet resilience. It does not seek the spotlight. It outlasts it. Final reflection. The Timbisha Shoshone endured one of the harshest climates on Earth, centuries of colonial neglect, and the rebranding of their homeland as a place of emptiness. And yet, they are still there, walking the same trails, drinking from the same springs, and speaking the names of the land in the language of their ancestors. What would change if we began to see such places, deserts, ruins, wilderness, not as blank spaces, but as landscapes already known, already loved, already lived in? Story 5. The birchbark economies of the northeastern woodlands. The dense forests of the northeastern woodlands, stretching from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic coast, from the Canadian Shield to the Appalachians, were once home to a wide network of indigenous peoples, including the Ojibwe, Mi'kmaq, Abenaki, Algonquin, Cree, and Wabanaki Confederacy. These cultures lived in a world of rivers and roots, snow and shadow, trees and stories. And among all the trees, none mattered more than the birch. Specifically, the paper birch, Bichila papyrifera, a slender, pale tree with bark that peeled in sheets, was far more than a plant. It was a resource, a tool, a shelter, and a trade good. It was, in many ways, the foundation of a vast and practical economy of knowledge. This story is not about kings or wars. It is about baskets, canoes, and knowledge written without ink. It is a story of how survival, especially in regions of intense cold and travel by water, was made possible through intimate ecological relationships. The birch was not merely useful, it was essential. The paper birch, a material of 1,000 uses. The bark of the paper birch is light, waterproof, flexible, and rot-resistant. It can be cut into large sheets without killing the tree, especially if harvested in spring or early summer. This unique combination of qualities made it an ideal medium for a variety of critical technologies. Canoes, lightweight, portable, and able to carry hundreds of pounds across lakes and rivers. Storage containers, boxes, envelopes, and even cooking vessels, bark folded and stitched with spruce root. Shelters, temporary or seasonal wigwams, and domed lodges could be covered in bark panels. Scroll, used by Ojibwe medicine societies to record mnemonic maps, teachings, and ceremonies. Torches and kindling. The oils in the bark make it flammable even when wet. The birch bark canoe, in particular, was a technological marvel. It enabled entire networks of trade, diplomacy, warfare, and seasonal migration across vast distances without roads or wheels. It could be made and repaired with no metal tools, using only stone, wood, spruce gum, and fiber. A single birch tree could provide the material for an entire canoe, or more commonly, several key panels stitched together over a frame of cedar or spruce. To know how to build one was to hold a form of engineering wisdom passed from hand to hand, not in blueprints, but in practice and memory. Mobility and the canoe world. Unlike more centralized, agrarian societies, the peoples of the northeastern woodlands were highly mobile, especially in seasonal cycles. In summer, they moved to fishing and gathering camps along lakes and rivers. In winter, they lived in smaller family units deeper in the forest, near hunting grounds. Spring and autumn brought movement to maple groves, berry patches, and trapping zones. All of this required transport, and in a landscape laced with waterways, the canoe was the centerpiece of that mobility. A birch bark canoe could be light enough for 1 or 2 people to portage between rivers, strong enough to carry entire families, dogs, and gear, fast enough to travel hundreds of miles along trade routes connecting communities from Hudson Bay to the St. Lawrence River. This mobility wasn't just practical. It shaped social structure, economy, and cosmology. The world was not bounded by a village or a single place. It was interconnected by rivers, and the canoe was both vessel and symbol of this interconnectedness. Trade and the birch bark economy. Long before European contact, northeastern peoples maintained extensive trade networks. Birch bark items were highly valued and traded for. Furs, beaver, muskrat, marten, chert and obsidian tools, shell beads from the Atlantic coast, copper from the Lake Superior region, wild rice, maple sugar, and medicinal plants. After European contact in the 16th and 17th centuries, these networks expanded and shifted. Beaver pelts became central to the fur trade, especially in exchange for metal tools, cloth, guns, and glass beads. Birch bark canoes became the primary means of transport for French voyageurs, fur trappers, and missionaries. Some indigenous communities specialized in crafting canoes for trade, exporting not just goods, but expertise. The French, and later the British and Americans, relied heavily on indigenous canoe builders and navigators. Entire expeditions through the interior of North America would have been impossible without indigenous-made canoes and the knowledge of how to use them. In this way, the birch tree, so quiet in the forest, became a key player in the economic transformation of a continent. Cultural and spiritual dimensions of birch. While the birch tree's utility is obvious, its symbolism and spiritual significance are more subtle but just as important. Among the Ojibwe, birch was considered a gift from the Creator, and many oral traditions explain its origins through sacred stories. One tells of a time when humans were in danger, and the birch offered itself as a shield against a great flood or fire. Others describe birch as the skin of the earth, protecting the deeper layers of spirit and soil. In ceremonies, birch bark was sometimes burned as an offering, or used to carry sacred herbs like sage, sweetgrass, or tobacco. The construction of bark containers could be ritualized, especially when used for food or medicine. Even more profound was the use of birch bark in scrolls, mnemonic tablets inscribed by the Midwiwin or Grand Medicine Society. These scrolls, often made from carefully prepared bark panels, were etched with pictographs that held teachings, ceremonial instructions, and healing knowledge. These were not public texts. They were guarded, passed only to those initiated into the layers of meaning. To outsiders, the markings might seem decorative, but to the initiated, they were a living archive. Knowledge without writing. In a world often measured by written documents, the birchbark scrolls remind us that knowledge can be transmitted in other ways through practice, symbol, and performance. A canoe builder may never draw plans, but he knows how to harvest bark without killing the tree, how to split cedar ribs by hand for flexibility, how to heat and mix spruce resin and charcoal for waterproofing seams, where to find fiber that won't rot when wet. This is embedded knowledge held in calloused fingers and muscle memory. It cannot be Googled, it must be lived. Even today, a handful of indigenous canoe makers such as those among the Ojibwe, Maliseet, and Mi'kmaq carry forward these traditions, building by hand using ancestral methods, and in doing so, resist the erasure of knowledge systems that colonization once tried to silence. To understand the economy and culture of the northeastern woodlands, one must forget modern maps and paved highways. In this world, the river is the road, a winding, seasonal artery of commerce, kinship, and cosmology. The birchbark canoe, so lightweight and graceful, was not just a craft. It was a key, unlocking a network of waterways that connected thousands of miles of dense forest, lake systems, and coastal inlets. This section explores the deeper implications of birchbark technology, not just how it enabled movement, but how it shaped political boundaries, intertribal alliances, intercontinental trade, and even the survival strategies of European colonizers, who often depended on indigenous transportation knowledge just to stay alive. A world of waterways. In the age before the wheel had much use in North America, the birchbark canoe ruled the East. This was a landscape made for water travel. The Great Lakes, St. Lawrence River, Hudson Bay, and hundreds of smaller rivers and portage routes created a fluid geography where distances were measured not by miles, but by days of paddling, stretches between portages, and the currents of the season. Even major political and linguistic boundaries between Anishinaabe and Algonquin speakers, or Wabanaki and Cree groups, were often defined more by watersheds than by land claims. The river did not divide, it connected. A canoe was not simply a vehicle. It was a mobile household, a trading booth, a diplomatic envoy, and a spiritual vessel all in one. Canoe diplomacy and intertribal alliances. Long before the arrival of European colonists, indigenous nations used their birchbark canoes to build and maintain diplomatic relationships. Gift exchange was a core practice, reinforced through canoe-borne visits. Marriages between groups were arranged across river systems, reinforcing political alliances. Ceremonial visits, often tied to the seasonal cycles, maintained obligations between clans and neighbors. These journeys were not spontaneous. They required careful planning, storage of surplus food, and navigational memory passed down through oral tradition. Knowing the location of every sandbar, beaver dam, and narrow channel was essential. To paddle into a neighboring territory was not an act of trespass, but of acknowledgement that shared waterways meant shared responsibilities. The fur trade and the rise of a birchbark empire. By the early 1600s, European traders and missionaries began entering the region. French, Dutch, and later British, often with little understanding of the terrain, the language, or the peoples who lived there. They brought iron tools, guns, beads, and cloth, and most importantly, a growing demand for beaver pelts, which were considered a luxury material in European fashion and industry. But these newcomers were entirely dependent on indigenous transportation systems. French voyageurs adopted the birchbark canoe wholesale, learning its design and maintenance from Ojibwe and Algonquin builders. The Hudson's Bay Company and Northwest Company built vast trading empires, yet their routes were impossible without birchbark boats and indigenous river guides. Even maps of the time were based on indigenous knowledge, often traced from verbal instructions and symbolic representations of waterways. In many ways, the success of the fur trade, and thus the wealth of European colonial outposts, was made possible by the birch tree and the people who knew how to use it. Portage and the culture of movement. Every canoe journey included portages, land crossings between rivers, often rugged, muddy, or steep. Here, the lightness of the birchbark canoe was essential. A 16-foot canoe could be carried on one man's shoulders. Larger ones required two paddlers and clever balancing. Packs of trade goods were bundled into tumplines or moose-hide sacks, then carried across with rhythmic endurance. Portages became social hubs, places where different traveling parties might meet, share news, or trade directly. Some portage routes were so heavily used that they left foot-worn trenches in the earth, still visible today. For those who followed the seasonal movements of fish and game, the canoe portage cycle was life itself. It organized labor, gender roles, and food distribution. Women's work and birchbark labor. While canoe construction and navigation were often male-dominated roles, birchbark as a material was central to many women's economies. Women harvested, soaked, stitched, and shaped birch into baskets of all sizes, often waterproof, for gathering berries, hauling water, and cooking. Cradle boards lined with soft moss and decorated with quillwork or beadwork. Birchbark boxes and scrolls for storing medicine and ceremonial materials. Cups, dishes, and pouches, some of which became trade items in their own right. The work was not only functional, it was aesthetic. Designs were often incised, dyed, or embroidered, blending practical knowledge with cultural expression. And as colonial pressures grew, these skills became even more important, allowing families to barter goods, preserve culture, and maintain autonomy in changing times. Birchbark and storytelling. In addition to its role in transport and economy, birchbark also served as a canvas for memory. Among the Ojibwe, the Midwewin Society created birchbark scrolls, etched with symbols that recorded medicinal knowledge, origin stories, ceremonial sequences, moral teachings. The scrolls were portable, durable, and protected from moisture. Each was not just a record but a mnemonic tool, activated through performance, sung, danced, or chanted into being. To the uninitiated, the scrolls seemed like codes, but to those trained to read them, they were libraries of experience. Even today, some elders carry fragments of these traditions, recalling not only what was written, but how it was sung into the world. The birchbark canoe, light, silent, made entirely of organic materials, once threaded through the vast waterways of the Northeast like a needle, stitching together peoples, places, and economies. But over time, the world that sustained that birchbark economy changed. The forests were logged. The beaver were trapped nearly to extinction. Colonial boundaries hardened into national borders. Rivers became industrial corridors. And the quiet, essential technologies of the birch were pushed to the margins, dismissed as primitive or replaced by metal, plastic, and gasoline. Yet not everything was lost. The story of birchbark and the people who worked it is not a relic. It is a living history, carried in memory, in practice, and in the continued presence of trees that still shed their bark in pale, curling ribbons waiting to be read again. Colonial disruption and adaptation. By the 19th century, European colonization had deeply reshaped the northeastern landscape. Forests were cleared for logging, settlements, and railroads. Indigenous communities were forcibly removed, confined to small reservations, or pressured into assimilation. Many birchbark practices declined not because they were useless, but because they were criminalized or devalued. Canoe use was discouraged, seen as a barrier to settling indigenous people into fixed, European-style communities. Birchbark medicine scrolls and ceremonial items were confiscated by missionaries or anthropologists, often mislabeled and stored in museums. Birchbark crafts were reduced to souvenirs, sold cheaply to tourists rather than recognized as expressions of cultural resilience. But even under these conditions, communities adapted. In many regions, birch bark work was maintained by women, elders, and seasonal artisans. Some began teaching their skills again in the 20th century, not to make a living, but to revive identity. Revival of birch bark canoe building. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, a handful of master builders and cultural teachers began to rebuild the knowledge chain of birch bark canoe construction. Among them was César Nuachiche, an Atacamaquah canoe builder from Quebec, whose work was documented in the 1971 National Film Board short César's Bark Canoe. The film shows, without narration, the entire process from cutting bark to sealing seams with spruce gum. Since then, Anishinaabe, Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and other communities have hosted canoe-building workshops, drawing younger generations back to the teachings of their grandparents. These aren't hobbyist projects, they're acts of reclamation. Building a canoe from scratch teaches not only how to paddle, it teaches how to harvest without damaging the tree, how to work in rhythm with natural materials, how to move and live on water, and how to carry stories that have no pages. Even modern paddlers who train in lightweight aluminum or fiberglass often speak reverently of their time in a true birch bark canoe. It creaks, it flexes, it floats low and quiet, it demands attention. It becomes, once again, part of the river. Birch bark in contemporary art and language. Today, birch bark continues to serve as a medium for cultural expression, not just in tools, but in art, literature, and education. Artist Carl Beam used birch bark as both canvas and symbol in his mixed media pieces, exploring identity and colonialism. Ojibwe poet Louise Erdrich named her bookstore Birchbark Books, grounding language and story in ancestral material. Language revitalization programs across Canada and the U.S. often use birchbark terms and stories to teach foundational ecological vocabulary to children. The bark still holds meaning not just in its physicality, but in what it reminds people to remember. Environmental and cultural parallels. In an era of ecological concern, climate change, and disrupted supply chains, the birch bark economy holds quiet insights. It used only what was needed and wasted nothing. It created tools that decomposed naturally. It taught mobility, adaptability, and respect for the land. It organized society around seasonal rhythms rather than fixed clocks. And it embedded stories in materials, not just symbols. These were not practices of the past. They are, perhaps, visions of a future yet to be built, one that listens more closely to the forest, the river, and the small things that carry meaning. The tree and the memory. To many northeastern indigenous peoples, the birch is still a relative. It is greeted when entered into the forest. It is thanked when bark is harvested. It is never cut without purpose, and when it offers itself voluntarily, through fallen limbs or naturally shedding bark, it is seen as participating in the continuation of culture. The canoe is not just a mode of travel, it is a vessel of memory. The basket is not just for berries, it is a container for relationship. The scroll is not just information, it is a language of wisdom. Birch bark, then, is not simply a material. It is a keeper of continuity, one that outlasted missionaries, fur traders, policies of assimilation, and industrial transformation. It still peels from the tree. It still holds the sun in its pale skin. It still waits for the next hand to shape it. Final reflection. A single tree, misunderstood as fragile or insignificant, helped build a continental network of trade, diplomacy, survival, and memory. What else might we have overlooked, not because it was loud or large, but because it was small, quiet, and always there? Story 6. Chinook Diplomacy, the Coastal Traders of the Columbia. The Columbia River begins in the snowmelt of the Rocky Mountains and cuts a path westward across forests, canyons, and plains until it spills broad, tidal, and gray into the Pacific Ocean. At its mouth, near what is now Astoria, Oregon, the water churns with power. The river meets the sea in a place of collision and convergence. And for centuries before European ships appeared on the horizon, that convergence was more than geological. It was cultural. Here lived the Chinook people, traders, navigators, and diplomats of the lower Columbia River, whose influence stretched far beyond their numbers. They did not build empires of stone or vast military campaigns. They built something quieter and perhaps more lasting, a network of trade, hospitality, and negotiation based on careful diplomacy and deep ecological knowledge. To understand Chinook society is to see a world where wealth moved by water, where language was fluid, and where survival rested not just on resources, but on relationships. This is the story of a people whose power lay not in conquest, but in connection. The Chinook world. The Chinook lived in what is now known as the Pacific Northwest, specifically along the lower Columbia River and adjacent coastal areas, with villages stretching from Cape Disappointment inland past the Dalles. The land here is lush and rain-soaked, filled with towering cedar trees, dense undergrowth, and rivers teeming with fish. The ocean's bounty mixes with inland abundance, creating one of the richest natural environments on the continent. But the Chinook were not simply consumers of this bounty, they were organizers of its movement. From the Pacific coast to the inland plateaus, they became masters of exchange intermediaries between coastal and interior peoples. Villages were often large, permanent, and strategically located near riverbanks and trading sites. Homes were built of cedar planks, arranged in rows, housing extended families and lineages. These structures weren't just shelters, they were symbols of wealth and stability, often adorned with crest poles and woven mats. Economy by waterway. Unlike agricultural societies, the Chinook did not rely on farming. Instead, their economy was built around the seasonal harvesting of natural abundance, especially salmon caught in massive seasonal runs and smoked for preservation. Yulican, also called candlefish, a fatty fish rendered into highly prized oil. Shellfish, berries, roots, and game all gathered with precision. But the Chinook were not just gatherers. They were middlemen facilitating trade between interior peoples, like the Sahaptin-speaking groups of the Columbia Plateau and coastal communities, such as the Tillamook and Clatsop. They traded dried fish, Yulican oil, and seashells for obsidian, buffalo robes, horses, and stone tools. The river was the highway. The canoe was the vehicle. The Chinook were the drivers of a regional economy that bound dozens of groups together. Canoes and carriers of culture. The Chinook canoe was more than a boat. It was an instrument of diplomacy. Carved from western red cedar, these canoes were deep-hulled and sleek, capable of ocean travel or river navigation. Often decorated with paint or carvings, indicating status or group identity. Able to carry not just people and goods, but message and presence. Canoe journeys were formal affairs. When approaching a village, paddlers announced themselves with songs, calls, or drum beats. To arrive unannounced was suspicious. To arrive in song was an invitation to exchange goods, news, alliances. In this way, Chinook diplomacy was literally paddled into being. The ability to move freely and safely through these waterways required not only skill, but relationships, trust built through gifts, ritual, and reciprocity. Chinook social structure and leadership. Chinook society was hierarchical, but not rigidly so. It was organized into high-status families, often those with the most wealth and control over trade routes. Commoners who engaged in day-to-day labor, fishing, and crafting. And an enslaved class, typically war captives, incorporated into households but held in servitude. Leadership was often inherited, but power rested on more than birth. A leader needed to be a skilled orator and negotiator, a generous host, able to stage large feasts and redistribute wealth, a keeper of names, lineages, and ceremonial rites. In this sense, Chinook leadership resembled a kind of economic and cultural brokerage, where prestige came from who you could connect, not just who you could command. The Chinook jargon, a language of trade. To manage such a vast trade network, the Chinook and their neighbors developed a lingua franca, a simplified trade language known as Chinook jargon. It was a blend of Chinookan-based vocabulary, Nuchanolth and Salish words, and later English, French, and Russian elements. Chinook jargon was used by hundreds of thousands of people at its peak, not just indigenous traders, but also European settlers, missionaries, and fur company employees. Its simplicity was deceptive. In practice, it allowed for complex negotiation, humor, and storytelling. It served as both a tool of diplomacy and a barrier breaker, smoothing relations between cultures with otherwise incompatible languages. Chinook jargon represents something rare in colonial history, a moment where communication was mutual, not imposed. Early contact with Europeans. When Lewis and Clark arrived at the mouth of the Columbia in 1805, they encountered a Chinook world that was already international. The Chinook had traded with Russian ships and Spanish galleons, seen British fur traders and American sailors, acquired iron tools, glass beads, and even firearms, adapting them seamlessly into existing systems. They met Lewis and Clark not as naive hosts but as savvy diplomats. They negotiated trade carefully. They expected gifts. They evaluated the newcomers' usefulness. The Americans, for their part, noted the Chinook's confidence, organization, and canoe technology, but failed to understand the depth of the social systems behind them. Contact brought new opportunities, but also disease, displacement, and disruption forces that would soon threaten the entire coastal world the Chinook had helped organize. When European and American powers arrived in the Pacific Northwest in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, they found a landscape already mapped by relationships. The Chinook were not simply inhabitants, they were gatekeepers to the interior. They knew who owed what, who had rights to which lands or rivers, and what goods were moving through whose hands. To these foreign powers, trade was often a transaction. To the Chinook, it was a social contract, embedded in protocols of exchange, gift-giving, and kinship obligations. But those distinctions between exchange and extraction, between alliance and acquisition, would soon prove fatal to the Chinook world. What had once been a diplomacy of rivers would slowly be undermined by policies written far from water, in capitals that had never seen a cedar canoe. The logic of exchange, Chinook protocols. For generations, Chinook diplomacy was built on gift economies. Wealth was not hoarded. It was given strategically and generously. When receiving guests, Chinook leaders offered feasts, furs, and stories. In return, they expected not payment but acknowledgement, that the giver was powerful, generous, worthy of respect. Prestige was measured not by what you kept, but by what you could afford to give away. This system was shared by many indigenous nations across the Northwest Coast and Plateau. It created networks of obligation, a flexible but enforceable matrix of mutual respect. In this context, trade with European ships was initially integrated, not resisted. The Chinook offered dried salmon, Yulican oil, canoes, and furs. In return, they received iron knives, copper kettles, glass beads, and eventually muskets. Early accounts from explorers and fur traders described Chinookan traders as skilled bargainers, not easily impressed, and quick to recognize manipulation. Disease, an invisible intruder. But even before formal colonization, an invisible force began to reshape Chinook society: epidemic disease. As early as the 1770s, long before most indigenous people saw a European in person, diseases such as smallpox began sweeping through coastal communities, likely transmitted by earlier contact along the Pacific coast or indirectly via overland networks. Over the next century, waves of measles, influenza, tuberculosis, and syphilis would devastate populations. Some estimates suggest that up to 90% of the lower Chinookan population was lost to disease before 1850. Entire villages were depopulated. Knowledge keepers died with their languages and histories intact but unrecorded. Survivors sometimes moved inland or joined neighboring tribes for protection and community. Disease did more than reduce numbers. It disrupted the social fabric that underpinned Chinook diplomacy. When key elders died, so too did the lines of alliance, the ritual obligations, and the memories of trade routes and ceremonial ties. By the time American settlers arrived in large numbers, the Chinook were still politically savvy, but severely outnumbered and increasingly isolated. Treaties and the problem of recognition. In the 1850s, following the Oregon Treaty and U.S. expansion into the Pacific Northwest, federal agents sought to consolidate land holdings by signing treaties with native nations, often to clear space for settlers and resource extraction. In 1851, Chinook leaders signed several unratified treaties with U.S. commissioners. They agreed to cede vast territories in exchange for land reservations, goods, and promises of recognition. But Congress never ratified those agreements. This failure left the Chinook in legal limbo. They had ceded land in good faith. The U.S. had received that land and allowed settlers to flood in. But the Chinook received nothing in return: no federal recognition, no land base, no support. For the next 150 years, the Chinook people would live on scattered parcels, invisible to federal policy, their diplomatic skills made irrelevant by bureaucracy and indifference. It was a betrayal not just of treaty law, but of the very principles of exchange and reciprocity the Chinook had embodied for centuries. The Chinook jargon after empire. Ironically, even as Chinook land and autonomy were taken, Chinook jargon continued to thrive. Fur traders, missionaries, loggers, and settlers adopted it as a lingua franca. It was used in towns, trading posts, and even church services in parts of Washington and British Columbia. Newspapers were printed in Chinook jargon. Children learned it alongside English or French. In a strange twist, the language of a displaced people became a glue for a settler society that had no intention of honoring Chinook sovereignty. By the early 20th century, however, as English gained dominance and indigenous languages were suppressed by boarding schools, Chinook jargon declined. Yet even now, it lingers in place names, regional slang, and in ongoing revival efforts by indigenous communities. A ghost language, still capable of speaking. Persistence through community. Despite the weight of history, the Chinook people endured. Families maintained ties to ancestral fishing sites, ceremonial grounds, and riverside villages. Canoe culture was kept alive through annual journeys, storytelling, and intertribal gatherings. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the Chinook Indian Nation, representing lower Chinook peoples, continued to advocate for federal recognition. In 2001, the U.S. government briefly recognized the Chinook Indian Nation, then, just months later, revoked that decision under pressure from political opposition. The reason? The treaties were unratified. The irony was complete. But the Chinook continue to press forward not simply as plaintiffs, but as cultural stewards, language keepers, and diplomats in their own right. They host cultural events, teach Chinookan language classes, and participate in the intertribal canoe journey, a powerful annual tradition that reaffirms coastal indigenous relationships through collective paddling and ceremony. The river still remembers, and so do they. The Columbia River still flows. It winds past salmon runs, under steel bridges, and through hydroelectric dams that now power cities far from the riverbanks. It has changed in depth, current, and color, but it remains a powerful presence, a witness to the world it once shaped and the people who once shaped it. The Chinook people are still here too, not as relics, but as participants in a world they helped build, a world now layered in history, conflict, and adaptation. In this final section, we explore how Chinook diplomacy endures not through treaties ratified or titles granted, but through the ongoing assertion of presence, ceremony, and sovereignty in a world that has tried again and again to erase them. A landscape remembered. To travel the lower Columbia River today is to move through palimpsest's layers of memory and meaning. The village site of Cathlapottle, once a major Chinookan center with longhouses and trading plazas, is now part of a wildlife refuge, but has been reinterpreted by Chinook descendants through archaeological partnership. Cape Disappointment, where Chinook canoes once greeted Spanish, Russian, and American ships, now hosts a lighthouse and state park, but its name obscures the welcome that took place there. Chinook Point, a National Historic Landmark, recognizes Lewis and Clark's arrival, but not the diplomacy that greeted them. In all of these places, interpretation matters. Chinook people have worked for decades to ensure that their stories are not only preserved, but centered so that visitors see not just land, but relationship. The modern canoe journey. One of the most vivid expressions of cultural continuity is the intertribal canoe journey, a practice revived in the late 20th century and now celebrated annually among Pacific Northwest tribes. Each summer, dozens of hand-carved canoes, some made in traditional cedar, others adapted from modern materials, travel ancestral waterways, stopping at host communities along the coast and river. These journeys reinforce language, protocol, and respect for water, engage youth in traditional practice and physical endurance, reaffirm alliances and kinship ties across indigenous nations. When Chinook paddlers launch their canoe named, painted, and blessed, they are not reenacting history, they are making it. They follow the old customs, announcing arrival with songs, asking permission to land, and offering gifts. These actions, once the foundation of Chinook diplomacy, now challenge colonial narratives that have treated them as a people of the past. The canoe says otherwise. Legal sovereignty and the struggle for recognition. The Chinook Indian nation continues to pursue federal recognition, a status that would allow for legal sovereignty, access to federal services, and formal protection of cultural resources. But recognition is not just about paperwork. It is about acknowledgement of history, of legitimacy, of survival. As of today, the Chinook remain unrecognized by the U.S. government, despite centuries of documented presence, historical treaties, even if unratified, organized tribal governance, cultural continuity, and land ties. In courtrooms, hearings, and community meetings, Chinook leaders assert that recognition is not about being granted rights, it's about having their ongoing existence accepted by a system that once pretended they were gone. Their motto, "We have always been here." Chinook language and education. Language is another field of resilience. The Chinookan languages, once considered dormant, are being revived through recordings, dictionaries, and classes. Community members gather to learn ceremonial phrases, teach youth greetings and songs, reclaim original place names and meanings. Meanwhile, Chinook jargon, once seen as a curiosity, is now understood as a symbol of intercultural adaptation, a real-world example of how communication can evolve cooperatively, rather than by domination. Through language, the Chinook are reasserting worldview, placing diplomacy, relationship, and land at the center once again. The river's lessons. What does Chinook diplomacy teach us today? It teaches that power can be relational, not hierarchical. Trade can be about balance, not conquest. Language can be a bridge, not a barrier. Wealth can be defined by what we give, not what we accumulate. These values, embedded in birchbark canoes, gift protocols, and seasonal movement, challenge assumptions about how societies must be structured. They remind us that the Americas were not empty. They were sophisticated, intentional, and interconnected long before colonization. And they offer alternatives to the modern systems of ownership, extraction, and disconnection that have often brought ecological and cultural harm. Final reflection. The Chinook once welcomed strangers to the mouth of a mighty river, offering food, trade, and diplomacy. Those strangers took the land, rewrote the rules, and forgot the names of those who had hosted them. But the river still flows. The canoes still launch. The songs still echo. What might it mean today to welcome the world again, but on Chinook terms? Story 7. The Iroquois Confederacy before contact. Law from the Longhouse. Before the settlers, before the ships, before the fur traders and iron tools and lines on maps, there was law. Not the kind carved in stone or signed in wax, but a law spoken into being, passed from fire to fire in the hush of the northeastern forests. It was a law of memory, of consensus, of rhythm, a law that grew from soil and story, and it bound together 5 nations, the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, into what would become one of the most influential political unions in North America long before Europeans ever arrived. This was the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, often called the Iroquois Confederacy by outsiders. Its name means people of the Longhouse, a metaphor for unity, governance, and shared survival. In this section, we explore the foundations of that confederacy, how it was born, how it functioned, and how it transformed a region from constant war into a long, uneasy peace. A landscape of fragmented power. Prior to the Confederacy, the world of the Haudenosaunee was marked by constant intertribal warfare. Small raids, blood feuds, and cycles of revenge destabilized the forested homelands of what is now upstate New York and surrounding regions. While each of the 5 nations had deep cultural similarities, language roots, agricultural practices, social organization, they were politically independent and sometimes enemies. The world was dangerous not only because of predators or hunger, but because honor demanded retribution. A death could not go unanswered. One killing bred another. The cycle seemed unbreakable until someone spoke peace. The great peacemaker and the birth of a union. Oral tradition tells of a man known only as the peacemaker who journeyed from the north, guided by visions. He saw a future where the Haudenosaunee were united not by domination, but by agreement. His message was not immediately welcomed. It was resisted, ridiculed, and even feared. But slowly, with the help of influential allies Hiawatha, a Mohawk man stricken by grief, and Jigginsassy, a woman known for her hospitality, he brought the 5 nations into a dialogue. Together, they planted the tree of peace at Onondaga, casting their weapons into the depths beneath its roots. This moment was not a myth, it was a political transformation. From it came the great law of peace, a detailed oral constitution outlining council structure, decision-making processes, roles of clan mothers and chiefs, protocols for resolving disputes, responsibilities to future generations. This law created a new kind of sovereignty shared, rotating, deliberative centuries before European theorists would propose similar ideas in their republics. The Longhouse as government. The Haudenosaunee lived in longhouses, wooden structures up to 200 feet long, housing multiple related families from the same clan. These homes were warm, communal, and filled with the noise of daily life. But the longhouse was more than a building. It was a political metaphor. The entire Confederacy was imagined as one great longhouse. The Mohawks stood at the eastern door, the keepers of the eastern door. The Seneca guarded the western door, the keepers of the western door. The Onondaga in the center were the firekeepers, the heart of the council. This structure emphasized balance, interdependence, and geographic reality. It also provided a mental map for diplomacy, decision-making, and ritual. When the council met, they gathered as if entering a shared home. There were rules of speech, of silence, of protocol. Debate was welcomed, but resolution had to be unanimous, a consensus model rooted in listening, not majority rule. Clans, matriarchs, and decision-making. Haudenosaunee society was matrilineal. Clans were passed down through mothers, not fathers, and each clan had elders and clan mothers who held significant power. In fact, clan mothers were responsible for nominating and removing chiefs, sachems, ensuring leaders acted in the people's interests, maintaining harmony within and between clans. This was not a society of queens and kings. It was a society where authority was distributed and where women's voices shaped the political landscape. The peacemaker had insisted on it. Peace could not be sustained unless the household, the place of first teaching, was also empowered. This structure produced a delicate but resilient system of checks and balances. Each nation and each clan had its place, and no one voice could dominate the others. Warriors without wars. After the Confederacy's formation, the 5 nations still trained warriors. They still hunted, protected, and moved with discipline. But within the Confederacy itself, warfare ceased. Disputes were resolved through compensation, ritual apology, or council mediation. This internal peace gave the Haudenosaunee time and stability to focus outward to build trade networks, manage land, and prepare for the challenges ahead. It also allowed for a sophisticated foreign policy. The Confederacy would go on to form alliances, rivalries, and treaties with dozens of other indigenous nations. Later, they would engage with colonial powers with strategic brilliance, sometimes playing the French and British against each other to maintain independence. But all of that came later. In these early years, the focus was inward. How do we live together without destroying each other? The answer, remarkably, was spoken law, carried in memory, adjusted in council, and held together by ceremony. The role of wampum. One of the key tools in this system was wampum shell beads, carefully strung into belts that recorded treaties, stories, and laws. Wampum was not currency, it was memory encoded in pattern. Each belt held a specific agreement or historical event, a symbolic pattern representing its meaning, the authority of those who had spoken the words it recorded. When treaties were remembered or reaffirmed, the wampum belts were read aloud, not visually interpreted like a script, but recited through oral memory by trained keepers. This made law and history performative, social, and alive. It required the participation of those who remembered, those who witnessed, and those who listened. And it meant that law was never divorced from people it traveled with them, in ceremonies, in councils, in the mind. The great law of peace was more than a set of guidelines, it was a living constitution, passed down through generations not by ink, but by ceremony, debate, and careful remembrance. And within that structure, every fire, every voice, and every path through the forest mattered. In this section, we'll explore how the Iroquois Confederacy functioned in daily life, how its governance systems operated, how external diplomacy worked, and how the balance of internal peace and outward expansion set the stage for centuries of strategic action. As we move deeper into the Longhouse, we begin to see how a society based on consensus could thrive in a world of constant flux, and what lessons that holds for governance, survival, and human adaptability. The Onondaga, keepers of the central fire. At the heart of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy sat the Onondaga Nation, both geographically and politically. The Onondaga were designated the firekeepers of the Confederacy, meaning they hosted the Grand Council of 50 chiefs. They maintained the symbolic central fire, representing unity. They were often the final voice in resolving disputes that could not be settled between the others. The council itself was structured with great care. Each of the 5 original nations had a fixed number of chiefs, whose titles were inherited through clans and appointed by clan mothers. There were 50 sachem positions in total, each with a name, e.g., Dekanewada Hiawatha, passed down through time, a specific seat in the council, an obligation to consult with their nation before speaking. When the council met, protocols governed everything from how to open the session with thanksgiving to how to present grievances. There was no voting. Instead, consensus was required. Chiefs spoke in a predetermined order, beginning with the Mohawk and ending with the Seneca. If full agreement could not be reached, the issue was tabled and revisited, sometimes months or even years later. This system prioritized unity over speed. It was a slow democracy, but a durable one. Law carried in voice and memory. Because the Haudenosaunee tradition was oral, memory served as record. The Great Law of Peace was recited in full at major gatherings, often taking days to perform. Chiefs and clan mothers were expected to know the genealogies, precedents, and rituals associated with law. Youth were trained in oratory, symbolic thinking, and listening skills essential for participating in council. Wampum belts provided visual memory aids, but the real law was spoken, and its authority rested in living performance. This made law deeply relational. It was not imposed by force or written edict. It was a social agreement, constantly reaffirmed in real time through shared stories and ceremonial gatherings. The role of women, authority from the hearth. While sachems chiefs were men, their authority depended entirely on women. Clan mothers chose chiefs, monitored their behavior, and removed them if necessary. Women controlled the land, harvests, and family lines, since lineage was traced through the mother. Elders, especially women, carried deep cultural memory, making them guardians of diplomacy. In times of dispute or war, clan mothers had the power to forbid warriors from going to battle, demand negotiations, redirect resources away from conflict. This balance of power ensured that no single voice or gender-dominated governance was both political and domestic, shaped in the longhouse and in the council circle alike. External diplomacy, allies, neighbors, and enemies. Internally, the Great Law created stability. Externally, the Haudenosaunee operated in a world of complex relations with other indigenous nations. Before European contact, the Confederacy maintained alliances with groups like the Tuscarora, who would later join the Confederacy as the Sixth Nation. Engaged in long-distance diplomacy with peoples as far as the Great Lakes and Appalachian regions. Controlled key trade corridors and mediated disputes among non-member nations. They were respected as peacekeepers, but also feared as strategists. In times of war, they could organize coordinated military campaigns, but their preference was always to incorporate others through agreement, including the practice of requickening, the ritual adoption of outsiders to replace lost clan members and restore balance. This meant the Confederacy could grow not just through birth, but through diplomacy. Entire communities could be invited in, given names, and placed under the protection of the Longhouse. The Law of the Seventh Generation. One of the core tenets of Haudenosaunee governance was that decisions must consider 7 generations into the future. This principle applied to land use, conflict resolution, economic decisions, leadership choices. It created a culture of long thinking, where short-term gain was often set aside in favor of long-term harmony. The forest was not just a resource, it was a trust held on behalf of descendants yet unborn. This ethic shaped everything from forest management to treaty negotiations, and it stands in stark contrast to modern systems often driven by quarterly outcomes or election cycles. Living in the balance, strength through peace. The Iroquois Confederacy was not without its tensions. Like all human systems, it faced challenges. Disagreements between nations, ambitions of individual leaders, external threats and internal debates. But for over 400 years, it maintained a form of intertribal governance that avoided civil war, resolved disputes, and navigated crisis through consensus. This longevity was not accidental. It was the result of a cultural commitment to shared survival, enforced not by punishment but by persuasion and ceremony. And when Europeans finally arrived with muskets, maps, and unfamiliar legal documents, they encountered not a fractured collection of villages, but a political union older than most European monarchies. By the time European colonists began pressing into the interior of North America in the 1600s, the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy already had centuries of governance, diplomacy, and regional influence behind them. They were not new players on an empty stage. They were established diplomats, traders, warriors, and lawmakers, operating under a constitution of peace older than many European nations. And when contact came, the Confederacy did not collapse, it adjusted, strategized, and played a long game. In this final section, we look at how the Great Law of Peace shaped Haudenosaunee responses to colonial contact, and how their political legacy echoes even now in governments, legal theory, and indigenous sovereignty movements. This is not just a story of survival, but of enduring influence. Early contact, diplomacy first. The first sustained contacts between the Haudenosaunee and Europeans came in the early 1600s with Dutch traders, followed by the French and later British. The Haudenosaunee quickly assessed the situation not as a matter of wonder, but as a matter of policy. Newcomers meant new tools, but also new threats. The question was, how to integrate them into the existing diplomatic landscape. They did what they had always done. Exchanged gifts before negotiations. Assigned clan relationships to foreign visitors, granting them symbolic roles as brothers, sons, etc., within the existing kinship structure. Insisted on reciprocity rather than submission. European diplomats often misunderstood this. They saw negotiation through a lens of treaties and sovereign power. The Haudenosaunee saw it as relationship maintenance, bound by expectations of balance, memory, and respect. When colonial officials failed to uphold these norms by seizing land, refusing gifts, or betraying agreements, they were seen not just as enemies, but as dishonorable kin. This led to carefully calibrated responses: alliance, war, embargo, or expulsion, but always with reference to the Great Law, which guided not only internal affairs but foreign relations. The covenant chain and the balance of power. One of the most important diplomatic tools the Haudenosaunee used with colonial powers was the covenant chain, a series of alliances and agreements with the British during the 17th and 18th centuries. The metaphor used was one of a silver chain connecting the Confederacy to the English crown. Like silver, it had to be polished regularly to remain strong, meaning renewed dialogue, reaffirmed obligations, and maintenance of balance. These metaphors, simple, powerful, and visual, allowed the Haudenosaunee to shape European understanding, placing themselves as equal partners in governance. They were not subjects, they were co-sovereigns operating under their own constitution. The covenant chain offered the Haudenosaunee strategic flexibility. At times, they used it to counterbalance French influence in the north, gain access to trade goods and weapons, maintain independence from both European empires. For over a century, the Confederacy maintained this diplomatic balancing act, acting as a middle force between rival empires, all while managing their own internal unity. Colonial pressure and legal divergence. As colonial settlements grew and European notions of property, borders, and ownership spread, the Haudenosaunee found themselves caught between two legal worlds. Their own system, based on oral law, land stewardship, and communal sovereignty, and the colonial legal system, based on written contracts, private ownership, and imperial jurisdiction. The two systems were not easily compatible. Where the Haudenosaunee saw land as relational held collectively, and responsibly colonists saw it as a commodity to be bought, sold, and enclosed. This led to repeated misunderstandings, some willful, others unintentional. Treaties were signed under different assumptions. Land was ceded that was never meant to be sold. Agreements made in good faith by Haudenosaunee diplomats were often interpreted as surrender by colonial authorities. Over time, these divergences would erode the territory and autonomy of the Confederacy, but the underlying structure, the Great Law of Peace, remained. Legacy and influence on American democracy. It may surprise some to learn that the framers of the United States Constitution were aware of, and in some ways influenced by, the Iroquois model of governance. In the mid-1700s, prominent colonial leaders including Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams met with Haudenosaunee diplomats, observed their council meetings, and discussed political philosophy. Franklin, in particular, was struck by the unity and structure of the Confederacy. He wrote, "It would be a strange thing if 6 nations of ignorant savages should be capable of forming a scheme for such a union and be able to execute it, and yet that a like union should be impractical for 10 or a dozen English colonies." This statement is patronizing, but revealing. It shows that European Americans borrowed from indigenous systems even as they worked to remove indigenous people from their lands. While the U.S. Constitution ultimately took a different form with centralized authority, voting, and checks and balances, many scholars argue that the concept of federated states and mutual cooperation among equal parties was modeled in part on the Iroquois example. The Haudenosaunee had demonstrated, centuries earlier, that diverse nations could govern together, without conquest, through consensus. Modern resilience and the Great Law today. Despite centuries of encroachment, removal, and legal marginalization, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy still exists. The Grand Council continues to meet at Onondaga, maintaining the traditional structure. Clan mothers still guide leadership decisions. Ceremonial cycles, wampum recitations, and language revitalization projects keep the Great Law alive. The Confederacy still issues passports, maintains international diplomacy, and asserts sovereignty. In recent decades, Haudenosaunee athletes have competed internationally under their own flag. Haudenosaunee legal scholars have pushed for recognition of indigenous law within broader legal frameworks. The Longhouse has not fallen. It has simply extended beyond its original walls. Reflection, law from the forest. The Iroquois Confederacy, born in an age of blood feuds, developed one of the most sophisticated governance systems in pre-contact North America. Its values consensus, respect, gender balance, oral law, and long-term stewardship offered a model of peaceful coexistence that shaped diplomacy for centuries. Its endurance is a testament to law as a lived experience, not just a written rule. The world today speaks of democracy, justice, and sustainability. But perhaps some of the deepest lessons in these values come not from philosophers of Enlightenment Europe, but from storytellers in a longhouse, gathered around a shared fire, speaking peace into being. Story 8. The Mississippian Engineers, Mounds, Maze, and Monumental Time. Long before the first European ever stepped onto the continent, North America had cities. Real cities planned, engineered, and governed. Cities with neighborhoods, ceremonial plazas, social stratification, and a food system capable of supporting tens of thousands of people. And among these cities, none was more extraordinary than Cahokia. Nestled just east of the Mississippi River near modern-day St. Louis, Cahokia emerged as the largest urban center north of Mesoamerica. At its height around the 11th and 12th centuries, it was larger than London and rivaled many of the cities of medieval Europe in population and complexity. But unlike the castles and stone walls of the Old World, Cahokia was built of earth layer upon layer, shaped with care, and designed to reflect a cosmic order. In this section, we explore the rise of the Mississippian world, the structure of Cahokia, and how architecture, agriculture, and astronomy merged to create a city of soil and stars. The rise of the Mississippian world. The Mississippian culture, which flourished from roughly 800 CE to 1600 CE, stretched across a vast region of what is now the southeastern and midwestern United States. Its influence ran from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Cahokia was not the first mound-building culture in North America. Earlier traditions like Adena and Hopewell had built ceremonial earthworks centuries before, but Mississippian societies brought a new level of urban centralization, agricultural intensity, social hierarchy, cosmological planning. At the heart of this shift was maize corn. Introduced from Mesoamerica and adapted to local conditions over centuries, maize allowed Mississippian people to produce surplus food, which in turn supported full-time artisans and leaders, long-distance trade networks, large-scale construction projects, social stratification. Cahokia was the crown jewel of this world. Cahokia, a city in earth. At its peak between 1050 and 1200 CE, Cahokia likely had a population of 15,000 to 20,000 people, possibly more when surrounding areas are included. It was a city of 120-plus mounds, including massive platform mounds, conical burial mounds, and smaller ridgetop mounds. A grand central plaza flanked by the largest mound of all, Monk's Mound. Woodhenge, a circle of upright timber posts used to track solstices and equinoxes. Residential districts, causeways, and stockade walls. The Monk's Mound alone was a feat of engineering. Over 100 feet tall, composed of an estimated 22 million cubic feet of earth, moved by hand in baskets, topped by what was likely a temple or elite residence. This was not haphazard piling. Mounds were geometrically aligned, often oriented to celestial events or cardinal directions. The city was laid out with intent, shaped by both earthly politics and cosmic symbolism. Society in layers. Cahokia was not an egalitarian community. Its design reflected a clear social hierarchy. The elite, possibly including priest kings, lived atop platform mounds, physically elevated above commoners. Ceremonial and political centers were restricted to specific precincts, separate from ordinary dwellings. Burial mounds like Mound 72 reveal individuals interred with exquisite grave goods, including mica, copper, and marine shell, alongside sacrificial burials, likely retainers or captives. Mound 72, in particular, stunned archaeologists. A male figure was buried with over 20,000 shell beads, arranged in the shape of a bird. Nearby were over 250 additional burials, including sacrificial victims, many young women. The precision and ritual nature suggest a complex religious cosmology, one that linked power, death, and the sacred. The society was bound together not just by food and labor, but by ritual performance, astronomical timekeeping, and shared belief in a tiered cosmos, one that included an upper world, sky, middle world, earth, and lower world, underworld. Woodhenge, time and timber. Cahokia's Woodhen, so named by archaeologists for its resemblance to England's famous stone circle, was a large circle of red cedar posts, rebuilt multiple times and aligned to solar events. It functioned as a calendar. At sunrise on the solstices and equinoxes, light would shine through specific gaps between posts. Community gatherings likely marked these moments with ceremony, renewal rites, or public announcements. Time for the Mississippians was not abstract. It was woven into space, visible in the sky and reflected on the ground in the layout of their city. The alignment of mounds, plazas, and woodhenge suggests a deeply held ritual cosmology, one that organized civic life around the movement of stars and the changing of seasons. A network of exchange. Cahokia didn't exist in isolation, archaeologists have found. Copper from the Great Lakes, mica from the Appalachian region, shells from the Gulf of Mexico, obsidian and chert from the Plains and Rockies. These materials came via trade routes that connected Cahokia to other Mississippian centers and distant cultures. Cahokia was both a spiritual center and an economic hub, drawing pilgrims, traders, and political emissaries. Its influence is visible in other mound sites such as Etowah, Georgia, Moundville, Alabama, and Spiro, Oklahoma, which adopted similar architecture, artwork, and religious symbols. This was not an empire in the European sense. There was no standing army, no written edicts, but there was a shared ideological and material world, centered on maize, mounds, and the ceremonial calendar. The city of Cahokia was not built overnight. Its rise unfolded over generations, gradually reshaping both land and society. From the river's edge to the tree-cleared plazas, Cahokia exerted a powerful pull not just as a place, but as an idea. It was a magnet for trade, belief, and bodies. People came not because they were forced, but because something larger than themselves had begun to take root in the very shape of the city. This section explores the engine behind Cahokia's growth, how its society functioned, how its monumental labor was organized, and how the gravity of ritual and maize transformed a patch of floodplain into a sacred and social machine. A city of pilgrims and laborers. The population surge at Cahokia around 1050 CE has puzzled archaeologists for decades. Prior to this moment, the area had small farming villages scattered across the American bottom floodplain. But something changed rapidly. Within just a few decades, villages emptied out and moved closer to Cahokia. Labor was redirected from farming toward construction. The landscape was cleared, leveled, and reorganized. A new form of society took hold, centered around ritualized hierarchy. Why? The answer seems to lie not in conquest, but in ceremony. Cahokia was not merely a political center. It was a spiritual capital, a place where earth met sky, and time could be made visible in wood, soil, and stars. People came to be part of something grand, something sacred. Organizing monumental labor. Building a mound like Monk's Mound required millions of baskets of soil, each carried by hand. Careful layering and engineering to prevent collapse. Decades of coordination with continuous maintenance. So how did they do it without wheels, draft animals, or centralized states? It appears Cahokia's labor force was seasonal, drawn from surrounding communities who came during ritual cycles. Rather than conscription, the labor likely resembled a communal obligation, framed in religious terms like a pilgrimage or a sacred duty. People arrived, worked, participated in festivals, and returned home with stories, status, or goods. This model was not unique. Across the ancient world, from the pyramids of Egypt to the terraces of the Andes, large projects were often built not by slaves, but by citizens tied together by belief and benefit. Cahokia fits this pattern. It was a ceremonial economy in which building became worship. Maize, the power behind the earthworks. The fuel behind Cahokia was maize. By the 11th century, maize agriculture had advanced to a level that enabled food surplus, freeing some individuals from subsistence labor. Storage systems using elevated granaries. Redistribution networks, where elites could host feasts or provision workers. The elite controlled access to this surplus. This wasn't a free market, it was a symbolic economy in which grain was wealth, and wealth meant obligation. By gathering food, redistributing it, and associating it with cosmic order, the ruling class embedded themselves into the ritual and agricultural cycles. Their power was not just political, it was spiritual, tied to the fertility of land and sky. And when they held ceremonies atop the mounds, overlooking vast plazas, they weren't just asserting dominance. They were performing the role of world keepers. Mound 72, power, death, and sacrifice. Among the 120-plus mounds at Cahokia, Mound 72 stands out not for its size, but for what it contained. Excavated in the 1960s and 70s, Mound 72 revealed the burial of a central male figure, laid on a bed of shell beads shaped like a falcon. Over 250 additional individuals, many buried in mass graves. A disproportionate number of young women, some of whom appear to have been sacrificed. These burials tell us several things. Status stratification was real and ritualized. Some lives were elevated, others expendable, likely tied to cosmology. The city's rituals included rites of death and transformation, possibly linked to elite renewal or celestial events. In Mound 72, we see both grandeur and violence, an unsettling reminder that spiritual societies are not always peaceful ones. But it also shows that Cahokia's elite operated within a mythic framework. Their lives and deaths were not just political acts, but cosmic performances, rooted in sacred narrative. The sacred landscape. Cahokia's design was symbolic in shape and function. The central plaza was a cleared, packed-earth space used for large gatherings, perhaps for markets, games, or ceremonies. The city's layout was aligned along cardinal directions, linking it to celestial movements. Some mounds were aligned with solar events, solstice sunrises, and equinox shadows. Woodhenge tracked the solar year, while mound positions echoed constellations and underworld symbols. This wasn't just practical urban planning, it was ritual cartography. Cahokia was a city-sized altar where space mirrored the cosmos. People didn't just live at Cahokia, they inhabited meaning. And in doing so, they brought their own identities, ethnic, linguistic, familial, into alignment with a shared spiritual calendar. A diverse population. Cahokia's residents were not homogeneous, burial evidence shows. Individuals with dental and cranial traits from as far away as the Great Lakes and Southern Plains. Trade goods that span thousands of miles. Artistic styles influenced by distant regions. This diversity suggests Cahokia was a cultural crossroads, a place where multiple identities blended. People came for reasons we can only guess. To trade, to learn, to witness ceremonies, to participate in renewal rituals, or perhaps simply to be part of something bigger than their village. What unified them wasn't ethnicity. It was ritual and architecture, food and cosmology. The mounds were not just monuments, they were social glue. Cahokia rose from the river floodplain with ambition and vision. It became a living monument to maize, ritual, and the stars, but just as rapidly as it grew, it faded. By the 1300s, Cahokia was largely abandoned. The mounds remained, overgrown by grass and time, but the plazas fell silent. No great fires burned in the ceremonial precinct. The wood posts that once aligned with the sun leaned, rotted, and vanished. This final section explores the mystery of Cahokia's decline, how a thriving city of earth dissolved into the soil that built it, and what its legacy tells us about the fragility of meaning, the power of memory, and the impermanence of even the greatest cities. A silent collapse. There is no clear, singular reason for Cahokia's abandonment. Unlike many ancient cities, there's no evidence of a violent destruction. No signs of invading armies, fire, or conquest. Instead, the end seems to have come gradually. A slow retreat, a city that simply emptied. Several factors likely converged. Environmental strain from deforestation, overhunting, and soil depletion. Flooding from changes in the Mississippi River's course. Internal social tensions, possibly over elite control or ritual practices. Climate variability, especially the onset of the Little Ice Age in the 1300s. The cumulative stress of managing a large, hierarchical urban center without written records or standing bureaucracies. In short, Cahokia grew faster than it could sustain itself, and when its carefully balanced systems began to falter, people left not all at once, but in waves. The city may have stopped functioning, but its people didn't disappear. They dispersed into smaller villages, carrying traditions, stories, and memories with them. Legacy in the landscape. Though Cahokia fell into disuse, its legacy did not vanish. The mounds, especially Monk's Mound, remained visible for centuries. Native people continued to visit, remember, and speak of the site, even as they lived elsewhere. And across the broader Mississippian world, mound building continued into the 1500s and beyond. Sites like Etowah, Spiro, and Moundville each experienced their own cycles of growth and decline. The Mississippian cultural system outlived Cahokia, even as the political center shifted. Today, over 800 known Mississippian mound sites dot the southeastern and midwestern U.S., though many have been destroyed or buried under modern cities and farms. The mound remains a persistent symbol, one of spiritual geography, communal labor, and the architecture of memory. The long echo in oral traditions. Indigenous oral traditions, particularly those of the Osage, Ponca, Omaha, and Quapaw, all descendants of Mississippian peoples, carry faint echoes of Cahokia. Some of their stories tell of sacred centers where sky rituals once governed social life, great leaders who lived elevated above others, both physically and spiritually, earthworks that oriented people to celestial events. While these oral histories rarely mention Cahokia by name, they often describe landscapes and cosmologies that match what we now understand of the Mississippian world. The knowledge survived not always in place, but in language, ceremony, and memory. Even in silence, the mound spoke. European contact and cultural disruption. By the time Europeans reached the Mississippi Valley in the 1500s and 1600s, Cahokia was already long abandoned, but the Mississippian cultural world still lingered. Spanish expeditions like Hernando de Soto's 1539–1543 encountered chiefdoms clearly descended from Mississippian traditions. These societies still used mound centers, ritual calendar systems, and maize-based economies. But disease, displacement, and colonial violence rapidly fractured these networks. Many mound centers were abandoned not because of internal failure, but because of external pressure. Introduced pandemics, especially smallpox, devastated populations, erasing oral knowledge, ceremonial specialists, and social continuity. By the 1700s, the memory of Cahokia had dimmed even further. The mounds were noted by explorers and settlers as curiosities, often misattributed to lost races rather than native ingenuity. Only in the 20th century did serious archaeological work begin to recover the truth of Cahokia, that it was an indigenous city, built with vision and labor, long before contact. Cahokia today: memory, erasure, and recognition. Cahokia is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and Monk's Mound still rises above the Illinois Plains, the largest prehistoric earthen structure in the Americas. But much of the original site is gone paved over, plowed flat, or developed into suburbs. Only about 80 of the original 120-plus mounds remain visible. And while archaeologists have done much to reconstruct Cahokia's history, public memory still struggles to grasp its significance. Cahokia challenges long-held assumptions that North America before Europeans was sparsely populated and primitive, that cities and states were only products of the Old World, that indigenous societies lacked complexity or governance. Cahokia forces us to ask, what do we remember and what do we forget? The architecture of meaning. Cahokia's mounds were not built to last forever. They were not temples of stone like Angkor or Rome. They were made of earth, which erodes, collapses, and returns to the land. But in this, there is a lesson. Perhaps the city was never meant to be permanent. Perhaps it was a ritual performance on a grand scale, renewed through repetition and labor, and abandoned when its meaning no longer held. The city, like a ceremony, had a beginning and an end. And its builders, who left no written language, left instead a landscape shaped by hands, visible from above, telling stories to those willing to look closely. Cyclone final reflection. If a city rises not from conquest but from shared belief, and if that belief fades, does the city vanish? Or does it live on in the shape of the land, in the silence of the fields, and in the memory of the earth beneath our feet?